The passage of time in the high Alpine valleys of the Ottonian Empire during the 10th century reveals itself not through the ticking of mechanical gears, but through the quiet, inevitable transformation of the earth. The golden hues of autumn, which once bathed the slopes of Bavaria in deep amber and warm copper, begin to yield to a more profound contemplative silence. The sun, riding lower along the southern horizon with each passing day, casts elongated shadows across the vast pine forests that drape the borders between the Germanic lands and the northern reaches of Italy. The air carries a crisp, unmistakable weight, an alpine chill that descends from the jagged limestone peaks, filtering through the dense canopies of fir and spruce. In the quiet hours of the late afternoon, the valleys fill with a soft silver mist, a low-hanging veil that blurs the boundaries between the earth and the darkening sky, wrapping the landscape in a stillness that signals the transition of the seasons. High upon the rocky promontories, the ancient stone monasteries and imperial estates stand as steadfast sentinels against the encroaching cold. Their thick walls, crafted from local limestone and rough-hewn granite, absorb the last faint rays of daylight, holding on to the residual warmth of a season that is gently slipping away. Inside these sanctuaries, the rhythms of life slow to a measured, deliberate pace. The heavy wooden shutters are drawn closed against the rising wind, and the stone floors, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, reflect the pale, flickering light of tallow lamps and beeswax candles. It is in this precise interlude between the final harvest and the true arrival of midwinter that the first snow begins to fall. It does not arrive with the fury of a blizzard, but rather as a quiet, drifting benediction. Individual flakes, each a perfectly formed crystalline geometry, tumble lazily through the still air, visible only as they pass through the beams of light escaping from the narrow abbey windows. They land without a sound upon the dark, rich soil of the monastery gardens, upon the dry, brittle stalks of lavender, rosemary, and sage that gave so generously of their fragrance during the warmer months. One by one, the flakes accumulate, transforming the rugged landscape into a seamless expanse of soft, muted white. The rough textures of the world, the jagged edges of fractured slate roofs, the gnarled bark of ancient oak trees, the uneven cobblestones of the courtyards are gradually softened beneath this growing blanket of winter. During these years, between the 960th and the 970th semesters of the Common Era, the empire finds its stability under the watchful guidance of Empress Adelaide. From her winter residences along the Alpine frontier, her presence is felt not through clamour or decree, but through a deep administrative mindfulness that mirrors the quietude of the season itself. As the frost deepens its grip on the landscape, sealing the mountain passes and slowing the flow of the great rivers to a sluggish, icy crawl, the focus of the realm shifts inward to the preservation of life and the maintenance of the hearths. The twilight of these late autumn days lingers with a peculiar translucent quality. The sky shifts from a pale washed blue into a deep velvety indigo, against which the first stars appear like distant points of silver light. From the chimney tops of the abbey and the distant hamlets, thin ribbons of pale grey smoke rise straight into the windless air, carrying with them the faint, comforting scent of burning birch and seasoned oak. Inside the scriptorium of the monastery, the scribes dip their quills into dark ink, the soft scratching of vellum providing a rhythmic counterpoint to the absolute silence outside. The pale light of the candles catches the gold leaf of the illuminated manuscripts, casting a warm, metallic gleam across the dark wooden tables. Outside, the frost continues its intricate work, tracing delicate fern-like patterns of ice across the small leaded glass window panes, obscuring the view of the snow-covered courtyard but creating an internal world that feels entirely safe, cloistered and serene. As the night deepens, the temperature drops further, sealing the earth in a crystalline embrace. The heavy oak doors of the monastery, reinforced with bands of black iron, are barred for the evening, isolating the inhabitants from the vast, untamed expanse of the winter wilderness. Under the stewardship of Empress Adelaide, these spaces are preparing to become something more than mere shelters. They are being readied to serve as centres of resilience, where the knowledge of the past and the resources of the present will be woven together to sustain the realm through the longest nights of the year. The geography of the Alpine borderlands, where the southern reaches of Bavaria meet the rugged northern passes of Italy, dictates a lifestyle of profound adaptation. In these high-altitude realms, the landscape is defined by vast, towering ridges of grey limestone and dark, metamorphic rock that slice through the low-hanging winter clouds. During the middle of the 10th century, this mountainous corridor served as the strategic and spiritual spine of the Ottonian Empire. It was a terrain of immense grandeur, but also of severe isolation. The narrow valleys, carved over millennia by rushing glacial rivers, now lay silent, the waters frozen into thick, translucent sheets of pale blue ice. The pathways that wound upward from the lowlands, ancient trails used by traders, pilgrims, and imperial messengers, gradually disappeared beneath successive layers of dense, packed snow. To traverse these passes in the depths of winter was an undertaking of immense difficulty, leaving the communities nestled within the valleys entirely dependent on their own internal reserves and the structural integrity of their settlements. At the heart of these isolated valleys stood the medieval stone monasteries, constructed to withstand both the passage of centuries and the seasonal violence of Alpine winters. These abbeys were architectural marvels of their time, built with heavy limestone blocks quarried from the surrounding cliffs. The masonry was thick, often measuring several feet deep, designed specifically to trap whatever heat could be generated within and to repel the biting northern gales that swept down from the high peaks. The roofs, pitched at steep angles to prevent the immense weight of the winter snow from collapsing the timbers, were tiled with heavy sheets of local slate that glistened with a pale, frosted sheen under the moonlight. The windows were small, narrow embrasures, deeply recessed into the stone walls to minimize the entry of cold air while still allowing thin shafts of pale winter daylight to illuminate the interior corridors. Walking through these spaces, one was acutely aware of the sheer mass of the stone, a solid, unyielding barrier that separated the vulnerable human world inside from the vast, freezing expanse of the wilderness outside. The isolation of these monastic complexes during the winter months created a unique social and spiritual microclimate. Cut off from the larger administrative centers of the empire, the inhabitants, monks, lay brothers, artisans, and local laborers, lived according to a rhythmic, self-contained routine. The daily passage of time was marked by the tolling of the heavy bronze abbey bells, whose deep, resonant tones carried across the snow-covered valleys, muffled by the thick winter air but providing a reassuring cadence to the rural population living in the shadow of the monastery walls. The surrounding forests, comprised of ancient pines and grand fir trees, stood like silent armies clad in white, their boughs bending low under the weight of the accumulated frost. Inside the monastery walls, every resource was carefully husbanded. The great timber stacks in the courtyards were meticulously organized. The grain silos were sealed against moisture, and the oil lamps were trimmed with precision to conserve every drop of fuel. It was an environment where survival depended entirely on foresight, order, and the enduring strength of the community's architectural anchor. As the winter of the 960s deepened, these borderland sanctuaries became the focus of Empress Adelaide's imperial attention. Recognizing that the physical isolation of the region left its population uniquely vulnerable to the hardships of the season, she sought to reinforce these stone fortresses of faith and knowledge, transforming them into centers of active stewardship. The light within the monasteries during these long nights was soft and amber, cast by small braziers and hearths that burned slowly in the communal rooms. The air carried the faint mineral scent of damp stone mingled with the dry, resinous perfume of pine wood burning in the furnaces. Every corner of the structure, from the high-vaulted ceilings of the chapel to the low subterranean cellars, existed in a state of quiet suspension, a peaceful endurance that mirrored the dormant earth outside. It was within these massive, isolated stone walls that the foundations for a grand experiment in winter care and architectural innovation would soon be laid, driven by a desire to bring warmth and security to the cold edge of the empire. As the final weeks of the year unfold, the descent of midwinter manifests as a profound, all-encompassing frost that reshapes the very texture of the Bavarian frontier. The ground, which only a month prior had been soft and receptive to the iron tips of the farmers' ploughs, freezes to the consistency of solid granite. This deep frost penetrates several inches into the rich earth, locking away the roots of the wild grasses and the remnants of the autumn crops beneath an unyielding crystalline seal. In the small agricultural hamlets that dot the valleys below the imperial monasteries, the vibrant, rhythmic labour of the fields comes to a complete standstill. The great wooden carts used for transporting hay and timber sit idle beneath open-sided sheds, their large wheels half buried in the accumulating ice. Hand-forged scythes, sickles and spades are carefully cleaned, greased with animal fat to prevent the creeping rust of winter, and hung upon the rough-hewn timber walls of the barns, resting until the distant return of spring. The impact of this severe weather on rural agrarian life is profound, shifting the focus of existence from outward labour to inward preservation. The daily routines of the peasant families contract to the immediate perimeter of their homes and livestock shelters. These humble dwellings, constructed from a mixture of wattle and daub and thick logs, are insulated with layers of dried moss and straw packed tightly into every crevice to repel the piercing winds. Inside, the hearth fire becomes the undisputed centre of the universe, burning day and night with a steady low flame fed by logs of ash and beechwood. The air inside the cottages is thick and heavy with the comforting smoky scent of wood fire, mingled with the aroma of drying wool and the slow, simmering pots of root vegetables and dried grains that provide sustenance during the long dark hours. The windows, small openings covered with oiled animal bladders or thick wooden shutters, admit only a dim, diffused light, reinforcing the sense of isolation and quiet containment that defines midwinter life. Nearby, in the low-ceilinged timber barns, the livestock are tended to with a meticulous, quiet devotion. The sheep, cows, and oxen, whose collective warmth contributes significantly to the survival of the farmstead, are nestled deep within thick beds of golden summer straw. The interior of these barns is a sanctuary of animal serenity. The only sounds are the soft, rhythmic chewing of cud, the occasional rustle of dry hay, and the deep, steady breathing of the cattle. In the cold morning air, the breath of the animals forms thick, pale plumes of white vapour that rise toward the rafters, condensing into delicate drops of frost upon the dark wooden beams. The caretakers move quietly among them, checking the water troughs for ice and replenishing the mangers with a gentle, measured efficiency. There is a deep mutual dependence in these spaces, an ancient understanding that the survival of the herd ensures the survival of the family when the earth outside offers nothing but ice and snow. Over the vast valleys, a thick midwinter mist settles with a quiet, majestic weight, blurring the distinctions between the landscape and the sky. This fog, heavy with the moisture of the Alpine peaks, pools in the lowlands like a silent, milky white lake, obscuring the pathways and isolating each hamlet within its own private sphere of quietude. The tops of the tallest pine trees pierce through the upper layers of the mist like dark, frosted spires, while the lower branches are completely enveloped in the dense, pale air. The sun, when it manages to break through the overcast sky, appears as a faint, pale silver disk, shedding a cool, ethereal light that does not warm, but rather illuminates the intricate, frozen beauty of the world. Every surface, from the smallest blade of dry grass to the grand stones of the imperial highway, is coated in a delicate layer of hoarfrost, transforming the entire borderland into a masterpiece of white and silver. In this world of absolute stillness, the passage of time slows to a whisper, allowing the earth to rest deeply beneath its winter mantle. The channel is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. Within the formidable stone walls of the imperial residence, which stood in harmonious architectural alignment with the great abbey, Empress Adelaide maintained a sanctuary of quiet governance. This winter retreat, positioned carefully to oversee the Alpine borderlands, was a structure defined by its soaring stone arches, deep-set hearths, and long, echoing corridors where the chill of the outside world was met with the steady, measured warmth of imperial hospitality. The interior spaces were draped in heavy, intricately woven tapestries that depicted scenes of seasonal harvests, ancient lineage, and peaceful landscapes, serving a dual purpose as both historical monuments and practical insulation against the persistent drafts that slipped through the masonry. Here, removed from the immediate clamour of the vibrant court in Aachen or the sunny plains of Lombardy, the Empress found herself in a space that encouraged deep reflection and administrative mindfulness. The environment was one of dignified restraint, where the crackle of the great hearths and the soft murmur of low-spoken councils formed the primary tapestry of sound. Adelaide herself, a figure of profound historical significance across 10th century Europe, possessed a state of mind that mirrored the calm resilience of the landscape she governed. Sitting by the tall, narrow windows of her private chamber, she watched the pale winter light shift across the snow-laden valley below, her thoughts deeply intertwined with the welfare of her subjects. Her position as regent and trusted advisor to the Ottonian dynasty was born not merely of political lineage, but of a genuine, deeply ingrained sense of maternal responsibility toward the realm. She understood that a sovereign's true strength was measured not by the grandeur of their victories, but by their capacity to protect the most vulnerable during times of natural hardship. As she observed the thin plumes of smoke rising from the distant snow-covered hamlets, she pondered the unique challenges of this particularly severe Bavarian winter, recognizing that the isolating frost brought with it a quiet emergency that required an innovative, compassionate response. The immediate surroundings of her working chamber reflected this fusion of imperial dignity and practical focus. Before her sat a massive dark oak desk, its surface polished to a smooth, deep sheen that caught the amber reflection of the beeswax candles illuminating her work. Upon this desk lay various administrative scrolls, architectural diagrams of the realm's fortified estates, and inventories of the imperial storehouses, each document held flat by heavy bronze weights shaped like sleeping lions. Her hands, adorned with the simple, elegant rings of her station, moved methodically across the parchments as she reviewed the capacity of the region's grain reserves and the availability of winter wood for the common hearths. Her attire was chosen with a characteristic blend of utility and grace, heavy gowns of fine local wool dyed in deep tones of madder red and forest green lined with soft, unpretentious furs that provided comfort in the drafty stone halls. Every aspect of her presence conveyed a calm, unshakable stability, a reassurance to her attendants and scribes that beneath the freezing skies, the heart of the empire remained warm, active, and deeply attentive. As the late afternoon faded into the deep indigo twilight of midwinter, Adelaide's deliberations turned toward the reports brought by her messengers regarding the depletion of traditional winter remedies in the surrounding villages. She knew that the frozen soil had locked away the life-giving herbs of the earth, and that the simple folk were facing the cold with dwindling resources. Rather than despairing at the severity of the elements, her mind, trained in both the classical traditions of the South and the practical law of the North, began to conceptualize a solution that would bridge the gap between architecture and medicine. She envisioned a transformation of the monastery's traditional spaces, a way to harness the structural warmth of the abbey to create a living, breathing haven against the frost. This quiet resolution, formed in the stillness of her candlelit chamber, marked the beginning of a grand undertaking that would soon turn the frozen borderlands into a testament to human ingenuity and imperial grace, ensuring that the long nights ahead would be met with light, warmth, and enduring care. Beyond the heavy oak doors of the imperial residence, nestled within the protective embrace of the monastery's central cloister, lay the traditional botanical gardens, known in the old manuscripts as the Hortus Conclusus. In the warm, golden months of summer, this enclosed square was a vibrant tapestry of colour, life, and intoxicating fragrances, serving as the primary source of medicine, seasoning, and spiritual solace for the entire community. Rectangular plots, meticulously bordered by low wattles of woven willow branches or neatly aligned rows of grey river stones, had groaned under the weight of flourishing vegetation. Here the monastic herbalists had spent their mornings harvesting the velvety grey leaves of sage, the delicate purple blossoms of thyme, and the tall resinous stalks of rosemary. It was a place where the air was always alive with the gentle hum of honeybees and the soft rustle of leaves in the Alpine breeze, a living testament to the harmony between human care and the abundance of the natural world. Now, however, midwinter had transformed this once thriving sanctuary into a realm of absolute stillness and monochrome beauty. The entire garden lay buried beneath a thick, pristine blanket of crystalline snow that had drifted evenly across the plots, erasing the sharp boundaries that had defined the summer landscape. The low willow borders were completely submerged, appearing only as subtle undulating mounds in the otherwise flat white expanse. The pathways of compressed gravel, which had echoed with the quiet footsteps of sandaled monks carrying wicker harvest baskets, were now indistinguishable from the beds themselves. Every surface was coated in a layer of fine, powdery snow that glittered like diamond dust whenever the pale winter sun broke through the heavy, low-hanging clouds. The vibrant green and purple hues of the growing season had faded into memory, replaced by a deep, contemplative silence that seemed to suspend the very passage of time within the stone walls. Despite the unyielding blanket of frost, a closer examination revealed the delicate structural skeletons of the dormant plants, standing as fragile monuments to the life that remained hidden beneath the surface. The hardy rosemary bushes, pruned back before the first true frost, poked through the snow like tiny, dark green spears, their narrow needles encased in a delicate, translucent sheath of ice that caught the pale light. The withered stalks of lavender, once heavy with aromatic blossoms, stood stiff and grey against the white backdrop, their brittle seed heads holding tiny caps of snow like miniature crowns. Beneath this frozen crust, deep within the dark, rich soil of the monastery beds, the roots of the perennial herbs remained locked in a deep seasonal slumber. The life forces of the plants had withdrawn completely into the earth, conserving their vital energies far below the reach of the biting alpine winds, waiting in perfect, patient submission for the distant promise of the spring thaw. In the centre of the cloister garden, a grand stone sundial stood as a silent witness to the slow, cold hours of winter. Crafted from a single block of local limestone, its surface was now dusted with frost, and its bronze gnomon cast a long, faint shadow across the snow, measuring a time that felt entirely motionless. Nearby, a shallow stone basin, which had served as a watering station for birds and a place for washing freshly harvested roots, was frozen completely solid. The water within had expanded into a thick plate of pale, opaque ice, fractured by deep internal silver veins that caught the light of the darkening sky. The wooden trellises that lined the interior stone walls, which had once supported the climbing vines of wild hops and sweet briar, now looked like intricate black lace draped against the pale masonry, their empty frames highlighting the absolute vacancy of the season. It was this scene of beautiful but sterile dormancy that Empress Adelaide contemplated from the high arches of the cloister walkway. She looked upon the frozen garden not with a sense of loss, but with the practical eye of a ruler who understood the cycles of nature. She recognized that while the earth slept, the needs of her people continued unabated, and that the traditional outdoor methods of cultivation were entirely helpless against the severity of the Bavarian winter. The sight of these buried treasures inspired her to rethink the relationship between the built environment and the natural world. If the open sky could no longer sustain the plants required to heal and comfort her subjects, then the massive stone architecture of the abbey must be adapted to provide a shelter where life could be nurtured even in the darkest depths of January. With this vision in mind, she turned away from the frosty courtyard, ready to set into motion the grand design that would bridge the gap between the winter wilderness and the warmth of human compassion. Deep within the central keep of the abbey, far removed from the biting winds that scoured the high alpine passes, lay the great council chamber. It was a space heavily insulated by centuries of stonemasonry, where the walls were thick enough to absorb the deepest winter chill and hold it at bay. The air inside this chamber carried a distinct comforting fragrance, a rich amalgamation of aged vellum, melting beeswax, and the slow, steady burning of seasoned oak in the massive stone hearth at the far end of the room. The flickering light from the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the vaulted ceilings, illuminating the intricate hand-carved wooden beams that supported the weight of the slated roof above. In the centre of the room stood a long, heavy table constructed from a single ancient walnut tree, its surface worn incredibly smooth by generations of scholars, abbots, and imperial envoys who had gathered there to debate the spiritual and administrative matters of the realm. On this particular evening, the gathering around the walnut table was not marked by the loud, echoing fanfare that typically accompanied imperial councils in the grand cities of the lowlands. Instead, it was characterized by a profound, purposeful quiet, a respectful silence that mirrored the hushed, snow-laden world outside the narrow windows. Empress Adelaide had summoned a unique assembly, bringing together two distinct pillars of knowledge that rarely intersected within the formal hierarchies of the 10th century. On one side of the table sat the monastic scholars and chief architectural masters of the abbey, older men draped in heavy dark woolen robes, their hands stained with iron gall ink and their minds filled with the classical geometries of Roman building techniques. Opposite them sat a quiet delegation of local female caretakers, midwives, village elders, and skilled herbalists from the surrounding Bavarian hamlets. They were wrapped in thick, undyed sheep's wool and boiled felt, bringing with them a deep, generational understanding of the Alpine forests and the traditional botanical remedies that had sustained the borderland communities for centuries. Adelaide took her seat at the head of the table, her presence grounding the room in a calm, authoritative grace. She did not speak with booming decrees or grand rhetorical flourishes. Her voice, when she finally broke the silence, was low, steady, and measured, designed to foster collaboration rather than command blind obedience. She spoke of the frozen botanical gardens she had observed earlier in the day, and of the reports reaching the imperial residents of the spreading winter fevers in the isolated valleys. The traditional stores of dried herbs, she noted, were dwindling faster than anticipated, and the sheer hostility of the freezing temperatures was rendering the small, drafty village cottages inadequate for the proper care of the vulnerable. She laid bare the reality of their situation. The earth had locked its medicinal bounty beneath the ice, and if they were to shepherd their people safely through to the spring thaw, they could no longer rely on the passive, separate routines of the past. As the quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered assembly, Adelaide gestured toward the center of the table, where the head librarian slowly unrolled a large, heavy sheet of pale parchment. The document, weighed down at its corners by polished stones, revealed the detailed architectural schematics of the monastery's foundational layout. It showed the vast network of cellars, the placement of the great baking ovens, and the thick protective outer walls of the cloister. The Empress proposed a radical yet profoundly compassionate integration of their collective knowledge. She asked the master builders to find a way to capture the excess thermal heat generated by the abbey's daily operations, and she asked the wise women of the villages to envision an indoor space where their herbal poultices and restorative broths could be administered in a stable, warm environment. For hours, the only sounds in the chamber were the soft crackle of the hearth, the gentle scraping of charcoal against parchment, and the low, thoughtful exchanges between the monks and the village elders. Ideas flowed back and forth in the warm amber light, weaving together the structural brilliance of stone masonry with the nurturing essence of herbal lore. Slowly, from this quiet confluence of minds, the concept of a dedicated winter infirmary began to take shape, a sanctuary of warmth built within the protective shell of the abbey, designed to defy the lethal grasp of the midwinter frost. The room filled with a renewed sense of purpose, a collective realization that they were on the precipice of creating a lasting haven of light and healing. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time. The dawn that followed the Imperial Council arrived with a pale, translucent clarity, casting a soft silver hue across the snow-laden ramparts of the monastery. Inside the masonry workshop, a space deeply insulated by thick limestone walls and heavy oak timbers, the atmosphere was one of quiet, concentrated focus. Here, the master stonemasons and monastic architects gathered, their heavy woolen cloaks thrown back over their shoulders to allow freedom of movement as they began the intricate task of reimagining the abbey's layout. The room was filled with the gentle, dry aroma of stone dust, mixed with the rich, resinous scent of pine logs burning slowly in a large copper brazier in the corner. Upon a long trestle table made of weathered pine, several large sheets of heavy calfskin vellum were laid out, held flat against the wood by the considerable weight of polished iron squares and heavy plumb lines. The collaboration between the secular masons, who spent their lives shaping the raw bedrock of the mountains, and the design-focused minds of the monastery, who understood the mathematical harmonies of architecture, was a masterclass in silent coordination. Brother William, the abbey's chief architect, leaned over the drawings, his long, ink-stained fingers tracing the existing lines of the monastery's south-facing wing. Beside him stood Master Heinrich, a veteran mason whose hands were calloused and greyed from decades of working with chisel and mallet. Together they studied the relationship between the great abbey kitchens, where massive fires burned continuously to bake bread and simmer immense cauldrons of broth, and the adjacent, vacant stone storehouses that ran along the southern perimeter of the cloister. The objective was clear. They needed to transform these cold, underutilized storage spaces into a unified, thermally efficient sanctuary without disrupting the structural integrity of the ancient complex. With a heavy, hand-forged iron compass, Brother William gently inscribed a series of soft, sweeping arcs onto the surface of the parchment, calculating the exact placement of new interior walls that would divide the long hall into smaller, more manageable chambers. The soft, rhythmic scratching of the tool against the vellum was the only sound in the room, save for the occasional deep pop of a sap pocket in the burning pine logs. They discussed the properties of different stones, choosing to use thick blocks of local ashlar limestone for the new internal partitions. This specific stone, known for its fine grain and dense composition, possessed an extraordinary capacity to absorb ambient heat and slowly radiate it back into the surrounding air over many hours, acting like a structural sponge for warmth. Every measurement was checked and rechecked with meticulous care, utilizing the ancient Roman foot as their standard of proportion, ensuring that the new arches would distribute the immense weight of the vaulted ceiling perfectly down into the existing foundations. To visualize the three-dimensional reality of their design, Master Heinrich stepped away from the table and used a piece of white mountain chalk to draw full-scale architectural joints directly onto the smooth slate floor of the workshop. The dry scraping sound of the chalk traced the outlines of the proposed heat flues and wall bases, allowing the builders to walk through the layout in real size. They designed a series of low, sturdy stone arches that would support a new lowered ceiling within the infirmary wing. By lowering the vertical space, they would significantly reduce the total volume of air that needed to be heated, effectively trapping the rising warmth closer to the floor level where the resting mats would be placed. Master Heinrich pointed out the small window openings, suggesting they deeply bevel the stone embrasures on the interior side. This clever masonry technique would allow the faint winter sunlight to reflect and scatter widely into the rooms, maximizing the natural light while keeping the physical openings small enough to minimize heat loss. The interaction between these two masters was devoid of ego, characterized instead by a mutual reverence for the materials they worked with and the noble purpose of their task. They understood that stone was a living history, a material that, when arranged with wisdom and precision, could shield human life from the most unforgiving elements. By mid-afternoon, the charcoal sketches on the vellum had been refined into a comprehensive blueprint of architectural salvation. Every flue, every arch, and every stone junction had been considered in relation to the human body's need for warmth and security. The master builders stood back from the table, their eyes reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a design well made. They knew that on the following morning, the silent workshop would give way to the rhythmic clinking of chisels and the heavy thud of stone blocks being moved into place, as they began to translate their paper lines into a tangible monument of imperial compassion under the watchful eye of Empress Adelaide. The architectural plans for the winter infirmary extended far beyond the modification of the interior rooms. They required a masterful reconfiguration of the external environment to shield the sanctuary from the relentless elemental forces of the Bavarian Alpine winter. On the large, sweeping sheets of calfskin vellum, the master builders turned their attention to the northern perimeter of the monastery complex. where the terrain sloped sharply upward toward the jagged, snow-covered ridges. It was from this specific northern quadrant that the most destructive elements descended, the biting sub-zero winds that swept down from the high glacial peaks, carrying with them sharp needles of ice and a cold so intense it could crack unprotected masonry. To counter this invisible, howling adversary, the designers conceived a system of massive external windbreak walls strategically positioned to deflect the northern currents up and away from the vulnerable, low-lying structures of the south-facing cloister. The geometric calculations required for these protective barriers were detailed with exceptional care on the parchment, using fine charcoal sticks that produced a soft whispering sound as they moved across the textured surface of the vellum. The architects traced the precise angles at which these new limestone walls would intersect the natural topography. They were not designed as a singular uniform obstruction which would have borne the full destructive brunt of the gales, but rather as a series of overlapping, staggered bastions. This brilliant arrangement was intended to capture the rushing air currents, forcing them to spin into gentler spirals, breaking their velocity before they could reach the central courtyard. The primary wall was designed to be extraordinarily thick, constructed from a double layer of rough-cut limestone blocks with a central core filled with tightly packed river gravel and mortar, creating an unyielding, dense mass capable of absorbing both physical pressure and extreme thermal stress. The height of these windbreak walls was calculated in perfect proportion to the pitch of the abbey's main roofs. By extending the height of the northern barriers several feet above the level of the infirmary's eaves, the builders created a structural shadow, a localized microclimate of absolute stillness on the southern side. The poetic beauty of this design lay in its absolute passivity. It required no fires or human labor to operate, relying entirely on the permanent, silent geometry of the stone to rewrite the wind's path. On the drawings, the shadows of these proposed walls were shaded with delicate cross-hatching of dark ink, illustrating how the freezing air would be forced upward, skimming harmlessly over the top of the sanctuary like water flowing over a smooth river stone, leaving the air below undisturbed, quiet and receptive to the warmth being cultivated within. As the scribes and masons refined these drawings under the watchful guidance of Empress Adelaide, they also considered the aesthetic integration of these massive barriers with the existing spiritual architecture of the abbey. The external faces of the windbreak walls, which would confront the full fury of the midwinter blizzards, were designed with a slight backward incline, a technique that allowed the weight of the wall to lean into the mountain itself, using the earth's own mass as a counterfort. The stones themselves were to be left rough and rusticated on the outside, their deeply textured surfaces mimicking the natural cliff faces of the surrounding mountains, which would naturally break up the cohesion of the wind. On the interior face, however, facing the quiet sanctuary garden, the masonry was to be finished with smooth, pale limestone ashlar, creating a bright, reflecting surface that would catch and multiply the low, precious rays of the winter sun, turning a barrier against the cold into a canvas for the pale alpine light. This meticulous design process was an act of profound dedication, a silent declaration that human intelligence and compassion could carve out a space of absolute peace in the midst of a hostile wilderness. Every line drawn on the vellum represented a future moment of comfort for a weary traveller or a fevered child, a guarantee that within the perimeter of Adelaide's creation, the howling winter would be reduced to nothing more than a distant, harmless murmur against the stone. With the completion of these exterior schematics, the grand architectural vision for the winter infirmary was now whole, balancing the internal generation of heat with the external repulsion of the cold, setting the stage for the physical manifestation of this sanctuary along the frozen borders of the empire. In the architecture of the 10th century, the mastery of heat was not a matter of simple convenience, but a sophisticated science of survival, deeply rooted in the preservation of fire as a sacred, living element. Within the massive stone perimeter of the Ottonian monasteries, heat was treated as a precious fluid, something to be captured, channeled, and husbanded with the utmost care. Traditionally, medieval large-scale buildings were notoriously difficult to warm. The vast, soaring spaces of the chapels and the long, high-ceilinged dormitories often remained pocketed with deep, stagnant chills that even the heaviest woolens could struggle to repel. However, certain vital hubs within the abbey complex functioned as perpetual engines of thermal energy. The master builders under Empress Adelaide recognized that instead of allowing this immense ambient warmth to escape fruitlessly into the freezing alpine sky, it could be captured and redirected through advanced stonemasonry to create an artificial oasis of life-giving warmth in the newly designated winter infirmary. The primary engine of this thermal network was the Great Abbey Kitchen, or coquina, which operated as the beating, fiery heart of the entire complex. Here, massive stone hearths and colossal brick baking ovens burned continuously from the early hours before dawn until well after the final evening prayers. Immense logs of seasoned oak, birch and mountain ash were fed into the roaring bellies of these furnaces to sustain the daily production of heavy rye bread, spelt pottage, and restorative broths for both the monastic community and the rural dependents. The thermal mass of these kitchen ovens was truly staggering. Constructed from thousands of dense, sun-dried clay bricks and encased in thick walls of riverstone, the structures absorbed an extraordinary volume of heat. Even when the fires were allowed to die down to a bed of glowing crimson embers during the deepest hours of the night, the bricks themselves continued to radiate a deep, intense warmth that kept the surrounding rooms perfectly comfortable, demonstrating the immense potential of stored heat. In close proximity to the kitchens lay another unique architectural feature of the abbey, the calefactorium, or the warming room, which was situated directly beneath the monastic scriptorium. In the high alpine altitudes of Bavaria, the intense cold posed a direct threat to the preservation of literacy and law. The iron gall ink used by the scribes would freeze and crack within its horn wells, and the delicate calfskin vellum would become too brittle to accept the scratch of the quill. To counter this, the architects had constructed a specialized underfloor heating system inspired by the ancient Roman hypocausts. A dedicated furnace located in a subterranean vaulted cellar forced hot air and aromatic wood smoke through a series of hollow masonry channels built directly into the foundations. This heated air did not enter the room directly, which would have filled the space with suffocating smoke, but instead warmed the heavy slate floor tiles from below, creating an even, rising column of gentle radiant heat that allowed the monks to work in absolute serene comfort. Empress Adelaide's grand design for the winter infirmary involved a brilliant, unprecedented integration of these two existing thermal centres. The master stonemasons were tasked with breaching the thick non-structural partition walls that separated the warm kitchen ovens and the calefactorium from the long, vacant storage hall that was to become the sanctuary ward. In place of the solid stone, they constructed an intricate system of horizontal, stone-lined conduits, thermal flues that ran directly along the base of the infirmary walls. These flues were designed to capture the excess hot air and radiant energy from the kitchen fires and the scriptorium furnace, drawing it through the length of the infirmary before allowing it to vent safely through a single, heavily insulated chimney at the far southern edge of the building. The physics of this design were elegant and entirely silent. The natural draft created by the rising heat pulled the warm air effortlessly through the stone channels, turning the entire foundation of the infirmary into a massive heat-retaining radiator. As the builders finalized the connection between the thermal engines and the new ward, the physical atmosphere within the space began to transform. The damp, tomb-like chill that had occupied the vacant storehouse for months began to recede, replaced by a dry, pervasive warmth that rose evenly from the newly laid stone floors. The air inside the room began to carry the faint, comforting characteristics of the kitchen, the subtle, toasted aroma of baking grains and the clean, resinous scent of well-burned hardwood smoke, completely stripped of its soot and ash by the filtering masonry channels. Walking into the space, one could feel the immediate, soothing embrace of the thermal radiance, a steady, unyielding barrier that stood defiantly against the howling alpine blizzards outside. This successful redirection of energy stood as a triumph of medieval engineering, a tangible manifestation of Adelaide's administrative wisdom that proved that even in the darkest, Coldest depths of winter, human ingenuity could harness the Earth's resources to create a haven of absolute peace and healing. The physical creation of the winter infirmary required materials of immense substance and durability, drawing directly from the deep geological foundations of the Alpine borderlands. A few leagues below the monastery, where the mountain slopes fractured into sheer vertical cliffs, lay the ancient imperial quarries that had supplied the region with stone for over 2 centuries. This particular deposit yielded a high-grade sedimentary limestone characterized by its fine, dense grain and its beautiful, pale silver-grey color. For generations, this stone had been prized by master builders for its unique physical properties. When first extracted from the earth, it remained relatively workable, allowing the masons to shape it with precision, but as it exposed its surfaces to the cold mountain air, it underwent a natural curing process, hardening into an unyielding, weather-resistant monolith. Locked within its layered strata were the tiny, fossilized remnants of primeval marine life, delicate shells and ancient crinoid stems, visible only as subtle, shimmering patterns under the winter sun, reminding all who looked upon them of the immense, silent passage of time. The process of gathering these massive blocks from the quarry floor and transporting them up to the abbey was an exercise in slow, rhythmic, and highly coordinated labor. In the deep midwinter, the traditional methods of wheeled transport were entirely useless against the heavy snowdrifts that choked the mountain paths. Instead, the quarrymen utilized heavy wooden sledges constructed from seasoned ash and reinforced with thick bands of hand-forged iron. The stone blocks, some weighing as much as a mature ox, were carefully pried from their mountain beds using iron wedges and long timber levers, their rough edges clinking softly against the frozen ground. Once positioned onto the sledges, the bottom runners were coated with a thick layer of rendered animal tallow, allowing the immense weight to glide smoothly over the hard, packed snow. The slow procession upward toward the monastery was marked by a quiet, determined cadence. The rhythmic creaking of the heavy timber frames, the soft, crunching sound of iron-shod boots breaking through the icy crust of the path, and the deep, steady exhalations of the teams of powerful oxen whose breath formed long, lingering trails of white mist in the freezing mountain air. Upon arriving at the central courtyard of the abbey, each limestone block was received by the master masons with a quiet, ritualistic scrutiny. Standing in the pale, diffused light of the winter afternoon, a mason would run his bare, calloused thumb along the face of the stone, feeling for the subtle variations in its texture and determining the natural bedding plane of the sediment. It was crucial that each block be oriented in the new wall exactly as it had lain in the earth for millennia, ensuring that the immense downward pressure of the structure would be distributed evenly across its strongest axis. To test the internal integrity of the limestone, the mason would take a small wooden mallet and gently tap the center of the block. A healthy stone, free of hidden fissures or internal faults, would respond with a clear, resonant ring that echoed softly against the surrounding monastery walls, while a dull, muffled thud indicated a secret weakness that rendered the piece unfit for the protective shell of the sanctuary. Once approved, the blocks were moved into the dressing sheds, where the stonecutters worked with a slow, hypnotic precision that filled the air with a faint musical rhythm. The steady, measured clink-clink-clink of iron chisels striking the limestone became the background melody of the courtyard, a sound that conveyed a deep sense of order and industrious calm. As the chisels bit into the grey surfaces, they produced a fine white stone dust that settled like a delicate frost over the dark wool of the masons' tunics and the wooden tool benches. Each block was carefully squared, its faces smoothed to ensure a tight, seamless fit that would leave no gaps for the biting northern winds to penetrate. The physical presence of these stones, cool to the touch, heavy with the mass of the mountain, and radiating a quiet ancient permanence, provided a profound psychological anchor for the community. They were the raw materials of security, the heavy protective shield that Empress Adelaide had ordered to be gathered, preparing to stand between the fragile lives of her people and the unforgiving winter sky. Under a pale, overcast Alpine sky that seemed to hang low over the monastery towers, the physical assembly of the winter infirmary's walls commenced with a quiet, synchronized regularity. The heavens on this morning offered no brilliant blue or piercing sunlight. Instead, a vast seamless canopy of soft charcoal-tinted grey blanketed the horizon, diffusing the daylight so perfectly that it cast no harsh shadows upon the snowy ground. In this muted ethereal light, the outdoor construction site became a theatre of deliberate, unhurried movement. The master stonemasons and their assistants worked with a profound understanding that haste was the ultimate enemy of endurance, especially in the sub-zero temperatures of the Bavarian winter. Every motion was calculated, every step measured, creating a workspace that felt less like a construction zone and more like a quiet, sacred ritual dedicated to the preservation of the empire's people. At the base of the new wall structure, the preparation of the mortar was an essential, almost alchemical process. In large wooden troughs protected from the immediate snowfall by temporary thatch lean-tos, the apprentices prepared the lime mortar that would bind the massive limestone blocks together for centuries to come. They mixed slaked lime, derived from burned limestone, with sharp river sand and clear water drawn from the abbey's deepest winter wells. As the dry components met the liquid, a natural chemical reaction occurred, releasing a gentle, localized heat and a thick, clean-smelling white steam that rose in soft plumes into the cold air. The sound of the wooden paddles turning the dense, heavy mixture was a rhythmic, squelching cadence, a wet, consistent thump that harmonized with the distant, steady chipping of the stone dressing sheds. This hot mortar was crucial. It had to be applied quickly before the freezing air could arrest its curing process, requiring the builders to maintain a seamless, unbroken chain of labor from the mixing trough to the mason's trowel. The actual positioning of the imperial limestone blocks was achieved through a masterful use of simple yet highly effective medieval mechanics. Large wooden cranes, constructed from stout oak timbers and rigged with thick multi-stranded hemp ropes, were positioned along the perimeter of the foundation. The creak of the dry wooden winches under tension was a low, resonant moan that echoed softly off the adjacent monastery walls. As the oxen or the team of lay brothers turned the great capstan, a block of finished limestone would lift slowly, almost imperceptibly, from its wooden transport sledge, hovering for a moment in the grey air like a weightless fragment of the mountain. The master mason, holding a broad-bladed iron trowel, would then spread a generous even bed of the steaming lime mortar onto the course of stone below, his arm moving in fluid, practiced arcs that left a beautifully patterned texture in the grey paste. With a gentle wave of the hand, the mason signalled for the stone to be lowered. The descent was a masterpiece of control, the massive block settling into the wet mortar with a soft, heavy compression that forced the excess paste to squeeze outward from the joints. The mason then utilized two fundamental tools of the ancient world to ensure absolute structural perfection: a heavy wooden spirit level containing a simple plumb bob and a long flax cord stretched tightly across the length of the wall. Standing in absolute stillness, his eyes fixed on the lead weight suspended by the slender thread, the mason waited patiently for the Alpine breeze to drop, allowing the plumb bob to come to a perfect motionless rest against the wood. Once satisfied that the wall was perfectly plumb and true, he would take a heavy wooden mallet and gently tap the corners of the stone, the dull, rhythmic thuds vibrating through the masonry as the block adjusted by mere fractions of an inch into its permanent resting place. With the block secured, the mason used his trowel to scrape away the excess mortar from the face of the stone, the distinct metallic scraping sound, a soft, dry hiss, providing a beautiful acoustic texture to the quiet afternoon. This excess mortar was returned to the bucket to be used again, ensuring nothing of value was wasted. The resulting joint between the stones was so tight, so perfectly executed, that not even the sharpest iron needle could find purchase between the blocks. As the courses of stone rose higher, layer by layer, the new wall began to form a solid, impenetrable barrier, a rising monument of silver-grey limestone that seemed to grow naturally out of the bedrock itself. The builders moved along the scaffolding with a silent, graceful efficiency, their breath forming small, fleeting clouds of vapour that dissolved quickly into the vast grey sky, leaving behind a structure built to weather the storms of 1,000 winters. Beneath the visible surface of the newly constructed winter ward, hidden completely from the eyes of those who would soon seek shelter within its walls, lay the true engineering marvel of Empress Adelaide's sanctuary, a sophisticated network of subterranean heating channels. Before the final floor tiles could be laid, the space resembled an intricate stone-lined labyrinth carved deep into the very foundations of the monastery. This system, heavily inspired by the classical hypocaust designs of Roman antiquity, was brilliantly adapted by the Ottonian master builders to suit the extreme demands of the Alpine climate. The floor of the ward was not designed to rest directly upon the damp, freezing earth. Instead, it was elevated upon a vast, orderly grid of low, stout pillars, creating a hollow, insulated chamber, a hidden void through which thermal energy could flow like an invisible river of warmth. The air within this underground matrix was perfectly contained, completely isolated from the living spaces above, to ensure that while the heat was captured, the suffocating smoke and ash of the furnace were safely directed away from the inhabitants. The construction of these subterranean flues required materials capable of withstanding constant, intense thermal stress without fracturing or degrading over the course of the long winter. The builders utilized thousands of dense, flat bricks composed of local river clay, baked in the abbey's high-temperature kilns until they achieved a rich terracotta hue and a clear, metallic resonance when struck. These bricks were laid in small square columns spaced exactly 2 Roman feet apart, forming a regular, geometric forest of miniature pillars that would support the immense weight of the stone floor above. The channels winding between these pillars were meticulously lined with smooth, non-porous slate panels, which served to minimize friction and allow the heated air to travel swiftly and evenly across the entire length of the hall. The auditory atmosphere down in these narrow conduits before they were sealed was one of absolute protected stillness, with the faint, dry aroma of baked clay and fresh lime mortar lingering in the confined space, a sensory testament to the hidden craftsmanship that underpinned the entire structure. The source of this subterranean vitality was the Profernium, a massive dedicated furnace room located in a vaulted cellar adjacent to the main kitchen complex. Within this stone-lined pit, large logs of seasoned hardwood were fed into a deep, brick-lined combustion chamber, generating a steady, high-volume flow of hot air and clean, carbon-rich gases. The connection between this furnace and the underfloor matrix was governed by a series of adjustable stone dampeners, heavy slabs of slate that could be slid forward or back by the attendants to regulate the velocity of the thermal draft. The physics of the system relied on the natural tendency of hot air to expand and rise, creating a powerful, silent siphon that pulled the heat out of the furnace and drew it deep into the labyrinth beneath the infirmary. As the thermal currents moved through the channels, the dense clay bricks and slate linings absorbed the raw energy of the fire, stripping the air of its initial, searing intensity and converting it into a gentle, thoroughly diffused warmth that permeated the very marrow of the building's foundations. Once the underground network was thoroughly tested and balanced, the masons began the meticulous process of capping the channels with the final floor surface. Massive, oversized slabs of pale grey limestone and dark mountain slate, measuring several inches in thickness, were carefully hoisted into place, resting perfectly upon the grid of terracotta pillars. The joints between these grand stones were sealed with a specialized mortar composed of crushed volcanic ash and slaked lime, creating a completely seamless, airtight barrier that prevented even the smallest draft from escaping upward. With the setting of the last stone, the subterranean labyrinth disappeared from view, leaving behind an environment that seemed to possess an almost magical quality. There were no visible hearths or open flames within the main ward to consume the oxygen or create dangerous embers. Instead, the entire floor surface became a vast, passive radiator. To walk across these stones was to experience a profound sense of elemental comfort, a steady, unyielding warmth that rose evenly from the earth, serving as a silent, invisible shield that Empress Adelaide had placed between her people and the deadly frost of the Alpine night. Deep below the intersecting arches of the main abbey chapel, down a flight of narrow, spiraling stone steps worn into smooth hollows by centuries of monastic devotion, lay the subterranean storage vaults. These chambers, carved directly into the limestone bedrock of the mount, existed in a state of perpetual cool equilibrium, completely insulated from the volatile seasonal changes of the upper world. While the winter winds outside howled across the frozen ridges, down here the atmosphere was perfectly still, heavy, and redolent with the captured essence of the previous summer. This was the apothecary's true treasury, the repository of the realm's botanical wealth, carefully gathered during the long, sun-drenched days of July and August, and preserved with meticulous care under the strict administration of Empress Adelaide. Upon opening the heavy iron-bound oak doors of the vault, a wave of complex concentrated fragrances broke over the threshold, a dense and comforting aromatic tapestry that immediately conveyed a sense of profound security and abundance. The physical environment of the vault was a masterclass in ancient preservation. Long, towering shelves constructed from thick boards of unpolished mountain cedar lined the limestone walls, their dark grains absorbing the faint, amber light of a single tallow lamp carried by the attending herbalist. The choice of cedar was deliberate, its natural oils acting as a gentle, fragrant deterrent against the creeping dampness and the tiny insects that might otherwise threaten the dried harvest. Resting upon these shelves were hundreds of uniform, hand-thrown clay amphorae and deep earthenware jars, each one sealed tightly with a thick disc of cork and coated around the rim with a protective layer of pure yellow beeswax. Hanging in dense, orderly rows from the low timber beams of the ceiling were thousands of tightly tied bundles of dried flora, their inverted forms creating a dark, textured canopy that rustled with a soft, paper-like whisper whenever a stray current of air moved through the room. As the eye adjusted to the dim, golden illumination, the individual details of this botanical harvest revealed themselves with a quiet, striking beauty. The air was a rich, multi-layered symphony of scents, each note telling the story of a specific field, meadow, or forest clearing along the imperial borderlands. There was the sharp, resinous, and pine-like perfume of dried rosemary, whose narrow needles had been stripped from their woody stalks and stored in great wicker baskets woven from river willow. Beside them sat massive linen sacks filled to the brim with the faded purple calyxes of lavender, releasing a clean, serene aroma that seemed to quiet the mind and slow the pulse of anyone who entered the vault. The earthier tones of dried sage and grey-leafed horehound pooled in the lower shelves, their velvety textures preserved perfectly by the absolute lack of direct sunlight, which would have bleached away their vital medicinal oils over time. On the higher ledges, carefully separated to prevent the mingling of their distinct properties, rested the delicate, brittle blossoms of chamomile and wild elderflower, their cream and yellow petals now shrunk to tiny, concentrated dots of summer light. The monastic scribes had labelled each container with a precision that bordered on the sacred, using small squares of pale vellum tied to the necks of the jars with slender flax cords. Written in a neat, regular Carolingian minuscule script, the ink labels listed the botanical name of the herb, the specific monastic garden or mountain valley from which it had been harvested, and the year of its collection. This rigorous documentation, supported and expanded under Adelaide's regency, ensured that the infirmary could locate and deploy any specific remedy with absolute efficiency, transforming the raw, chaotic abundance of nature into a highly organized library of healing. To touch these dried stores was to commune with the very memory of the earth. A handful of dried peppermint leaves, when gently pressed between the fingers, produced a crisp, crackling sound, a fragile, tactile reminder of the summer rains and the warm soils that had once nourished them. The fragrance that blossomed from this gentle friction was sharp, cool, and intensely revitalizing, cutting through the dense, heavy atmosphere of the cellar like a clean breath of mountain air. These vaults represented a defiance of winter. Within their dark, stone boundaries, the life of the realm was held in a state of suspended animation, preserved against the lethal frost by the foresight of human labor. As the herbalist carefully selected the specific jars and bundles required for the newly constructed winter ward, the heavy doors were once again closed and barred, sealing the aromatic treasury back into its peaceful, silent slumber, a hidden wellspring of health ready to be drawn upon to sustain the empire through its longest nights. Among the various botanical treasures brought up from the dark, silent depths of the monastic vaults, none held a more profound association with the restoration of vitality and warmth than the great bundles of preserved wild thyme. Known in the Latin texts of the Abbey Library as serpillum, this humble, low-growing herb was regarded by 10th century healers as a sovereign remedy against the creeping, damp chills of the winter season. In the pale amber illumination of the winter infirmary, the dried sprigs appeared deceptively fragile. Their slender woody stems, which had once clung tenaciously to the sun-baked rocks of the Alpine foothills, were now a deep dusty brown, while the tiny oval leaves had faded to a soft, muted hue of greyish-green. Yet, despite their brittle appearance, these plants retained within their cellular structure the concentrated essence of the summer sun, a latent potency that waited only for the application of warmth to release its comforting protective properties into the sanctuary air. The harvesting of this wild thyme was a historical ritual that connected the monastic community deeply to the natural rhythms of the high Alpine meadows. During the peak of the summer solstice, when the days were at their longest and the mountain sun beat down with a fierce golden intensity upon the limestone crags of the Bavarian frontier, the village women and lay sisters would journey up into the high pastures. There, far above the damp tree line, the wild thyme grew in dense, fragrant mats that carpeted the rocky earth in vibrant shades of lilac and deep purple. The gatherers would move slowly across the sun-drenched slopes, their movements unhurried and synchronized with the steady, ambient drone of thousands of wild honeybees that swarmed over the blossoms. Using small, crescent-shaped iron sickles, they would carefully clip the upper stems of the plants, taking only what the meadow could spare, and place the fragrant yield into large, open-weave wicker baskets that allowed the warm mountain breezes to circulate through the harvest, preventing the delicate leaves from bruising or fermenting in the heat. This summer lineage was essential to the 10th century understanding of the herb's medicinal value, which was viewed through the lens of traditional humoral theory. According to the ancient medical texts preserved in the scriptorium, wild thyme was classified as possessing an inherently hot and dry nature. In the worldview of Empress Adelaide's era, illness was often conceptualized as an imbalance of the bodily humors, brought about by the external dominance of the seasonal elements. The profound, unyielding cold of the Bavarian midwinter, combined with the damp mists that pooled in the valleys, was thought to introduce an excess of cold and fluid into the human system, manifesting as heavy fevers, stagnant coughs, and a general weariness of the spirit. To counteract this elemental invasion, the hot and dry properties of the preserved thyme were deployed as a natural balance, a structural counterweight designed to dry the excess moisture and reintroduce the gentle, vital heat of summer directly into the cold-worn bodies of the people. Within the walls of the newly warmed winter ward, the preparation of the thyme became a deeply sensory experience that contributed immensely to the peaceful atmosphere of the space. One of the village elders, sitting upon a low wooden stool near the thermal flues, began the slow process of stripping the dried leaves from their woody stalks. Her hands, lined with the wisdom of many winters, moved with a rhythmic, mesmerizing regularity that produced a soft paper-like rustle, a gentle, continuous whisper that seemed to melt into the background of the room. As her fingers pressed and crumbled the fragile sprigs into a large hand-carved maple bowl, the physical friction broke the invisible oil glands on the underside of the tiny leaves. Instantly, the ambient air of the infirmary was transformed, filled with a rich, complex, and intensely earthy fragrance that was both pungent and profoundly comforting. It was a scent that carried notes of dry mountain soil, warm pine resin, and a subtle, spicy sweetness that seemed to cut through the stagnant winter air, creating a localized environment that felt immediately clean, fortified, and entirely safe from the howling wilderness outside. Alongside the bundles of wild thyme, the healers of the winter infirmary brought forth the sturdy, resinous branches of dried rosemary, a plant whose structural endurance and sharp, clean character made it an indispensable pillar of the winter sanctuary. In the medieval taxonomy of the Ottonian era, rosemary, known in the Latin texts as rosmarinus or the dew of the sea, held a position of high honor, bridging the gap between the coastal landscapes of the Mediterranean and the frost-bitten Alpine valleys of Bavaria. The specimens preserved in Empress Adelaide's storehouses were of exceptional quality, their stiff, woody stems hosting dense clusters of narrow, needle-like leaves that retained a deep, dark green hue on their upper surfaces and a soft silver-grey texture underneath. Unlike other, more fragile herbs that crumbled easily into dust when subjected to the dry warmth of the underfloor heating channels, the rosemary needles remained robust, holding their vital essential oils deep within their leathery skins, waiting to be coaxed out by the steady, radiant heat of the limestone floors. When these green needles were gently gathered and scattered across the warm stone surfaces near the resting mats, the olfactory transformation of the ward was immediate and profound. The air filled with a brilliant pine-like scent, a rich and sharp aroma that carried the crisp clarity of an ancient evergreen forest combined with a subtle, resinous sweetness that lingered pleasantly in the senses. This fragrance possessed a unique, clarifying quality that seemed to instantly cut through the heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the midwinter isolation. For the weary travellers and local tenants who had spent weeks cooped up in small, smoky timber huts where the air was thick with the soot of unvented hearths, entering the rosemary-scented atmosphere of the infirmary was like stepping into a clean, mountain clearing. The sharp, clean notes of the herb had a comforting effect, clearing the senses and creating a tangible feeling of spatial openness and purity within the heavy stone walls of the abbey, allowing the inhabitants to rest in an environment that felt completely refreshed and fortified against the cold. Beyond its physical attributes, rosemary carried a deep wealth of cultural and historical symbolism that resonated powerfully with the medieval mind, particularly regarding its ancient association with memory and fidelity. In the classical texts preserved within the scriptorium, scholars had long noted that the persistent, unyielding fragrance of rosemary was believed to strengthen the mind's capacity to retain knowledge and recall past events. In the context of the winter infirmary, this association with remembrance took on a deeply comforting psychological significance. For those resting within the ward, isolated from their traditional routines and surrounded by the great white silence of the Alpine winter, the familiar, unchanging scent of rosemary served as a gentle sensory anchor. It reminded them of the enduring continuity of life, of the sun-drenched summers that had passed, and of the inevitable return of spring that lay beyond the frost. It was a fragrance that spoke of constancy, the constancy of the earth's cycles, the fidelity of the community's care, and the unshakable, maternal protection that Empress Adelaide extended over every corner of her realm. The application of this noble herb within the daily routine of the sanctuary was performed with a slow, deliberate care that added to the overall cadence of peace defining the space. Attendants would steep the resinous branches in large earthenware vessels of hot spring water, creating a steaming, fragrant wash that was used to cleanse the worn linen sheets and to soothe the weather-chafed skin of those who had arrived from the high passes. As the gentle steam rose from these vessels, mingling with the soft golden candlelight that illuminated the limestone arches, it created a scene of absolute dignified serenity. The rhythmic movement of the caregivers, the steady warmth rising from the subterranean flues, and the clean, comforting presence of the botanical remedies worked in perfect harmony to establish a true harbour for the spirit. If you find comfort in these quiet historical journeys and wish to experience more stories of peace and human ingenuity from the ancient world, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking this narrative and sharing it with others who might welcome a gentle, restful sanctuary for their thoughts. The room remained cradled in this aromatic embrace, a testament to the idea that true governance was an act of sustained, thoughtful compassion that could turn the harshest winter into a season of quiet restoration and enduring hope. In the quiet hierarchy of the monastic botanical library, the transition from the resinous clarity of rosemary to the soft, enveloping embrace of dried lavender marked a shift toward absolute tranquility within the winter ward. Lavender, known in the traditional Latin manuscripts as lavandula, was treated by the caregivers with a gentle, almost reverent touch, for its primary purpose within the sanctuary was not to stimulate or clarify, but to induce a profound sense of inner stillness and peace. The specimens preserved within Empress Adelaide's winter storehouses were exquisite in their structural delicacy. Gathered during the late summer afternoons when the mountain heat had reached its absolute peak, the lavender stalks had been tied into uniform, compact bunches using slender threads of raw hemp. Over the months of storage in the cool, dark vaults, their once vibrant violet and deep purple blossoms had gently faded into a soft, dusky hue of lavender grey, their delicate petals becoming crystalline and brittle, yet retaining their aromatic integrity perfectly within their tiny, tightly wound calyxes. As the warm air rising from the subterranean flues circulated through the high-vaulted stone room, it brushed against these suspended bouquets, causing them to sway with an almost imperceptible rhythm against the pale limestone walls. This gentle thermal movement released a slow, continuous cascade of serene fragrance that settled over the resting areas like an invisible, comforting blanket. The aroma of this aged lavender was distinct from its fresh, summer counterpart. It was completely devoid of the sharp, green intensity of a living field, possessing instead a mellowed, deeply grounded and earthy character that felt thoroughly seasoned by time. It carried the faint, sweet memory of distant, sun-drenched hillsides, mingled with the clean, neutral scent of the dry linen sheets upon which it fell. For the occupants of the ward, the introduction of this fragrance created an atmosphere that felt immediately sacred and protected, a space where the heavy anxieties of the winter survival could be laid down in favour of a quiet, untroubled rest. The preparation of the lavender for the evening hours was a task assigned to the younger lay sisters and village apprentices, who moved through the shadows of the ward with a quiet, practiced grace. Sitting near the amber glow of the great hearth's feeding terminal, they would carefully untie the hemp strings from the lavender bunches, their movements unhurried and rhythmic. They would take each individual stalk and gently rub it between their open palms, a soft, friction-based technique that produced a continuous paper-like rustle, a soothing, delicate whisper that seemed to melt into the background tapestry of the room. As the friction broke the crystalline structures of the dried blossoms, the tiny bead-like flower heads would separate cleanly from the woody stems, raining down into large, shallow bowls of hand-carved linden wood. This process filled the immediate air with a dense, concentrated cloud of lavender dust, which caught the flickering candlelight like tiny specks of floating gold, creating a visual display of quiet industry that was as beautiful as it was purposeful. In the 10th century understanding of health and wellness, which Empress Adelaide so meticulously supported through her patronage, lavender was regarded as a supreme comfort for a restless spirit. The ancient texts studied in the scriptorium suggested that the gentle, cooling nature of the herb was perfectly suited to pacify the internal storms of the mind, smoothing away the jagged edges of exhaustion and replacing them with a harmonious internal equilibrium. When scattered across the warm stone floor tiles near the heads of the resting mats, the dried blossoms would continue to release their essential oils under the influence of the constant, underfloor radiant heat. The resulting environment was one where every breath taken by the weary was an infusion of absolute serenity, a natural, non-medicinal sedative that worked in perfect harmony with the architecture of the building to foster a state of deep, restorative rest. Within this aromatic harbour, the howling of the Alpine blizzards outside the heavy wooden shutters seemed to lose its power entirely, reduced to a distant, meaningless murmur that only served to emphasize the absolute security, warmth, and peace that had been cultivated within the stone walls of Adelaide's sanctuary. Beyond the cultivated parameters of the cloister gardens, the vast, untamed alpine forest that draped the lower slopes of the Bavarian mountains served as an extended repository of healing materials for Empress Adelaide's winter infirmary. While the snow had rendered the open fields barren, the ancient woodlands remained resilient, their deep roots drawing strength from the earth far below the frost line. The collection of these forest materials was a task that required an intimate, generational knowledge of the timberlands, an understanding of how to read the dormant signs of the trees during the dead of winter. Local woodwrights and monastic foresters would venture into the quiet white wilderness under the pale morning skies, their eyes trained to identify specific species whose bark and resin held the vital protective properties needed to combat the unique physical afflictions brought on by the extreme cold. Among the most prized acquisitions from the winter forest was the thick, fibrous bark of the silver willow trees, which grew in abundance along the edges of the frozen mountain streams. In the 10th century tradition, this bark, known in the local dialects for its power to cool the heat of inner fevers and soothe the deep aches of the joints, was harvested with an exceptional, respectful care. The gatherers would seek out mature branches that had been cast down by the weight of the early winter snows, avoiding injury to the main trunks of the living trees. Using small curved iron skinning knives, they would carefully score the frozen wood, peeling away the rough grey outer layer to reveal the pale reddish-brown inner bark beneath. The texture of this inner layer was remarkably complex. It was tough, stringy, and deeply redolent, with a bitter, clean, and astringent scent that spoke of its potent medicinal properties. Brought into the warmth of the abbey workshops, these strips of bark were laid out upon woven reed mats near the thermal flues, where the dry, rising heat slowly evaporated the residual winter moisture, turning the pliable fibers into brittle, concentrated scrolls ready to be steeped into restorative infusions. Simultaneously, the foresters sought out the grand ancient pine and spruce trees that formed the dark green canopy of the mountain ridges, hunting for the valuable deposits of natural resin that accumulated along their trunks. Resin was the tree's own defensive mechanism, a thick, viscous amber fluid that seeped from the bark to heal fissures caused by lightning, wind, or the heavy shearing of ice. In the sub-zero temperatures of the Bavarian midwinter, these liquid secretions had solidified into crystalline, golden tears that clung tenaciously to the rough bark like precious gems of the forest. The gatherers would use flat wooden spatulas to gently pry these amber clusters from the trees, a process that filled the crisp air with an intense, intoxicatingly clean aroma of pure pine and sharp turpentine. The physical texture of the raw resin was fascinatingly varied. On the outside it was hard, frosty, and dusted with fine snow, but when pressed between the fingers, the ambient heat of human skin would cause it to soften, revealing its sticky, intensely aromatic core, which held the concentrated vitality of the evergreen forest. In the laboratories of the winter infirmary, these raw forest materials were integrated into traditional remedies through a series of slow, methodical processes that contributed to the overall atmosphere of purposeful calm. The dried willow bark was broken into small fragments, the distinct dry snapping sound providing a crisp acoustic texture to the quiet room, before being submerged in large copper cauldrons of simmering water to release its bitter pain-relieving essence. Meanwhile, the golden lumps of pine resin were placed into small earthenware pots and positioned carefully near the edges of the hearth, where they were gently melted down and combined with pure yellow beeswax and rendered animal fats. This ancient compounding technique transformed the sticky forest sap into smooth golden ointments and protective balms, applied to the rough, cracked skin of the labourers and the frost-bitten limbs of travellers. These resinous salves provided an immediate, comforting barrier against the elements, locking in bodily moisture and imparting the deep, restorative strength of the winter forest directly to those in need within the safe, stone sanctuary of Adelaide's court. The organisation of care within the winter infirmary was built upon a quiet yet revolutionary alliance of human hands, orchestrated under the attentive gaze of Empress Adelaide. In the social architecture of 10th century Bavaria, the boundaries between the cloistered life of the abbey and the secular existence of the rural hamlets were typically distinct, separated by vows, walls, and traditions, yet the severity of the midwinter frost demanded a suspension of these rigid divides. To manage the intricate preparation of the botanical remedies, and to provide constant comfort to those sheltered within the warm stone ward, Adelaide formed a dedicated guild of caregivers. This unique circle united the monastic sisters of the abbey, women whose lives were dedicated to the study of ancient medical manuscripts and the precise measurements of the apothecary, with the skilled laywomen and village elders of the surrounding valleys, who possessed a practical, fluid knowledge of the Alpine flora, passed down through generations. Together they formed a living bridge of compassion, their collective efforts transforming the cold stone repository into a profoundly peaceful workshop of human healing. The physical presence of these women moving through the amber light of the infirmary added an element of rhythmic grace to the sanctuary. The monastic sisters wore heavy habits of undyed black wool that absorbed the dim candlelight, their faces framed by neat white linen wimples that caught the soft reflections of the hearth fire. Beside them, the village elders and midwives were clad in practical kirtles of deep blue or earth-brown homespun cloth, insulated with layers of boiled felt and sheepskin capes. Despite the differences in their stations and attire, they moved with a shared, unhurried intentionality. The soft collective rustle of their long skirts sweeping across the warm limestone floor tiles created a continuous ocean-like whisper that became a defining acoustic characteristic of the space. Their footsteps were deliberate and quiet, executed with a practiced care that ensured the resting occupants of the ward were never startled by sudden or disruptive sounds, maintaining an atmosphere of absolute, predictable serenity. Empress Adelaide frequently joined this circle of caregivers not as a distant sovereign issuing commands from an elevated throne, but as an active, deeply invested participant in the preservation of her people. Sitting upon a simple wooden bench near the central herb sorting tables, she facilitated the sharing of knowledge between the two groups. Under her guidance, the monastic sisters would read aloud from the ancient Latin translations of Galen, translating the complex classical concepts into the local vernacular. In return, the village elders would share their empirical observations regarding the specific timing of infusions and the exact combinations of forest materials required to soothe a deep chest ailment. Adelaide watched with quiet satisfaction as these two distinct lineages of wisdom merged seamlessly in the warm air of the ward. Her own hands, accustomed to signing imperial decrees, were often seen helping to sort the dried willow bark or to measure out the precise quantities of wild thyme, demonstrating to all that the highest act of governance was the humble, direct service of those in need. The daily routine of the guild was a masterclass in silent, non-verbal coordination. The workshop area of the ward was divided into specific stations, each dedicated to a particular phase of the botanical preparation. At the first table, older village women inspected every leaf and stalk brought up from the vaults, separating the finest specimens from any stray debris or dust. At the adjacent station, monastic sisters utilized small brass scales and accurate lead weights to divide the herbs into standardized portions, ensuring that every batch of restorative pottage or tonic maintained a consistent potency. Further down the hall, near the direct flues of the great furnace, younger apprentices managed the copper cauldrons, watching the slow rise of the herbal steam with a steady, watchful patience. There was no shouting or frantic movement. Each woman understood her role completely, responding to the needs of her companions with a simple nod of the head or a gentle hand gesture, creating a symphony of purposeful labor that was as soothing to watch as it was effective. The emotional impact of this dedicated guild extended far beyond the physical efficacy of the remedies they prepared. For the sick and the weary who had crawled out of the freezing winter wilderness into the abbey's embrace, the mere sight of these women working in perfect, peaceful harmony provided an immediate, profound sense of psychological security. The caregivers exuded an aura of calm certainty, a collective reassurance that the chaos of the winter elements could be mastered through order, patience, and love. When a caregiver approached a resting mat, her movements were accompanied by the gentle, comforting sense of the herbs she had been handling. The clean perfume of lavender clinging to her sleeves, or the warm resinous aroma of pine ointment on her fingers. She would speak to the sufferer in a low melodious whisper, her words carrying the soft, reassuring cadence of a mother comforting a child in the dark. In this way, the Guild of Caregivers became the true soul of Adelaide's winter infirmary, weaving a web of human tenderness that insulated the realm against the deepest cold. Deep within the sunless undercroft of the south wing, running parallel to the newly completed thermal flues of the main ward, a large vaulted chamber had been cleared to serve as the workshop for the creation of the sanctuary beds. In the architecture of 10th century care, A bed was far more than a simple place of repose. It was the primary line of defense against the systemic exhaustion that accompanied winter illness. To rest upon the bare, cold stone, even stone warmed from below by subterranean fires, was insufficient for the complete restoration of a weakened body. A proper barrier was required, a structural layer that could insulate, cushion, and hold the body in a state of soft equilibrium. Under the direct supervision of Empress Adelaide's household managers, this room became a centre of quiet, tactile industry, where the raw, rustic yields of the summer agricultural season were meticulously transformed into instruments of profound comfort and safety. The foundational material for these beds was the great bolts of hand-woven flax linen, stacked in heavy, neat columns along the limestone walls of the workshop. This fabric, crafted by the village weavers on tall upright looms during the quiet weeks of the autumn harvest, possessed a remarkable structural integrity. It was unbleached and unrefined, retaining the natural variegated hues of the flax plant, shades of pale oatmeal, deep stone grey, and warm, earthy beige. To the touch, the linen was initially stiff and coarse, its thick, multi-stranded threads displaying the subtle irregularities of hand-spun yarn. Yet this very roughness was a testament to its durability. It was a fabric built to withstand the rigorous laundering of the monastic kitchens and the constant friction of daily use without tearing or thinning. As the young apprentices unrolled the heavy bolts across the long wooden workbenches, the cloth produced a low, snapping sound, a heavy, satisfying rustle that filled the lower register of the room's quiet atmosphere. To fill these linen casings, the lay brothers brought in immense wicker hampers filled to the brim with dried mountain straw, harvested from the high terraces of the Bavarian foothills. This straw was the choice remnant of the summer wheat and rye crops, selected specifically for its length, flexibility, and absolute dryness. Having been stored in the high, well-ventilated lofts of the monastic barns away from the creeping damp, the straw had cured to a beautiful uniform shade of pale amber gold. When a worker reached deep into the hamper to gather a bundle, the material responded with a crisp, multi-layered crackle, an acoustic chorus that filled the vaulted workshop with the unmistakable sound of a sun-baked field in late August. It was a dry, clean sound that seemed entirely disconnected from the freezing, silent blizzards occurring outside the thick abbey walls. The scent that blossomed from the shifting straw was deeply nostalgic and comforting, carrying notes of warm earth, dried grass, and the sweet, faint aroma of fermented summer grains. The process of stuffing the mattresses was performed with a slow, methodical rhythm that resembled a traditional communal craft. Two caregivers would stand on opposite sides of a long linen sack which had been sewn with an opening at the top end. Working in perfect, unspoken coordination, they would take alternating handfuls of the golden straw, shaking it gently to disperse any lingering dust before packing it deep into the corners of the fabric. It was crucial that the straw be distributed with absolute uniformity. An uneven packing would create hard lumps and cold pockets that would distress a resting patient. The workers used long, smooth batons of polished hazelwood to push the straw deep into the recesses of the casing, their arms moving in fluid, repetitive arcs that maintained a steady cadence. The physical sensation of the work was deeply tactile, the cool, abrasive texture of the flax linen exterior contrasting sharply with the springy, energetic resilience of the packed straw within. Once the mattress had achieved its proper full proportion, thick enough to elevate a body several inches off the floor tiles, the opening was sealed using long, hand-forged iron needles and thick cords of unspun hemp thread. The sound of the heavy needle piercing the dense linen hems was a distinct, rhythmic scratching, a crisp mechanical punctuation that cut through the soft rustle of the straw. Following the packing of the straw, a secondary layer of comfort was introduced in the form of soft woolens and carded sheep's fleece, sourced from the monastery's own mountain flocks. This raw wool, washed in clear spring water but intentionally left rich with its natural lanolin oils, was spread in thick fluffy sheets over the top of the straw mattresses. The lanolin imparted a faint, clean and animal scent to the bedding while providing a natural, water-resistant barrier that would lock out ambient moisture and retain the rising thermal heat from the underfloor flues with exceptional efficiency. By the time the candles in the workshop had burned down to their mid-marks, casting long golden reflections across the stone floor, dozens of the finished beds had been piled neatly near the exit, ready to be transported into the main infirmary ward. They stood as tangible monuments to the foresight and organizational brilliance of Adelaide's administration. Every mattress was an accumulation of summer light and human labor, designed to cradle the weary and the sick in an environment of absolute physical security. Brought into the warmed amberlit hall of the sanctuary, these beds would be laid out in neat orderly rows along the limestone walls, their soft inviting bulk offering an immediate, non-verbal promise of sanctuary. To look upon them was to understand that within this fortress of compassion, the harsh, destructive priorities of the winter wilderness had been utterly banished, replaced by a deep, enduring commitment to the gentle preservation of human life. As the deep midwinter night wraps its velvety indigo mantle around the high stone towers of the abbey, the internal acoustic landscape of the winter infirmary shifts into a state of profound, rhythmic regularity. Within this long vaulted hall, the physical properties of the architecture act as a natural acoustic amplifier, softening the sharp edges of human activity and blending them into a continuous, soothing tapestry of sound. The soaring limestone arches overhead receive the ambient whispers of the room, reflecting them downward as a gentle, uniform murmur that fills the open space. Outside, the Alpine blizzard continues its wild, unpredictable dance, the freezing winds striking the heavy wooden shutters with a distant, hollow thud that only serves to emphasize the absolute security and stillness achieved within the perimeter of the masonry. Inside, the primary melody of the sanctuary is not one of spoken words, but a deeply comforting mechanical cadence that arises from the preparation of the evening's botanical remedies. At the far end of the ward, illuminated by the steady golden radiance of several large beeswax candles, sits the preparation circle. Here, the village elders and monastic sisters operate the heavy stone mortars and pestles that are the essential tools of the apothecary's craft. These implements are objects of immense physical substance, hand-carved from dense blocks of local granite, dark basalt and pale mountain marble. Each mortar bowl is deep and thick-walled, its exterior left rough and rustic to provide a secure grip for the caregiver, while its interior basin has been polished to a smooth, matte finish through years of constant use. The pestles, heavy columns of matching stone tapered to fit perfectly within the palm of a hand, possess a substantial, comforting weight that allows the natural laws of gravity to assist in the labor of reduction. The interaction between these stone surfaces constitutes the beating heart of the room's auditory atmosphere. The sound produced by this labor is a masterclass in rhythmic repetition, a slow hypnotic sequence that anchors the attention of all who rest within the hall. It begins with the measured, low thud of the stone pestle descending into the basin, fracturing the brittle structures of the dried willow bark and the dense nodules of golden pine resin. This initial heavy impact is immediately followed by a sweeping circular motion, a dry, scraping hiss as the stone pestle is pressed firmly against the inner walls of the mortar, grinding the botanical fragments into a fine, uniform powder. The cadence is remarkably consistent, a soft clink, scrape, thud that repeats with the unhurried precision of a slow pendulum. There is no haste in the movements of the women. Their arms rise and fall with a fluid, relaxed grace that has been perfected across a lifetime of seasonal care. This steady tempo fills the lower registers of the room, creating an auditory anchor that effectively replaces the chaotic, howling patterns of the winter storm outside with an artificial rhythm of absolute human order. As the dried leaves of the wild thyme, the faded lavender blossoms, and the resinous needles of the rosemary are subjected to this methodical friction, the auditory experience is accompanied by a subtle matching transformation of the air itself. With every circular stroke of the pestle, a tiny, almost imperceptible cloud of aromatic dust rises from the mortar basin, catching the pale beams of candlelight as it drifts lazily upward into the vaulted space. The room becomes a theatre of fragrance where the sharp, clean scent of the crushed evergreen needles blends seamlessly with the warm, earthy sweetness of the pulverized roots. This olfactory release is intrinsically tied to the acoustic rhythm. One can hear the exact moment a fresh handful of herbs is introduced by the sudden crisp crackle of the dry leaves, followed by the gradual softening of the sound into a muted, velvety whisper as the plant matter yields completely to the weight of the stone. For the patients resting upon the thick linen mattresses nearby, this continuous, low-toned symphony of mortar and pestle functions as a profound source of psychological comfort. The predictability of the sound, the knowledge that the next thud and the next scrape will arrive exactly when expected, creates a sense of absolute environmental stability. It is an auditory manifestation of the protective care that Empress Adelaide has established along the frozen borderlands. The rhythm mimics the steady, slow pulse of a body at complete rest, acting as a non-verbal reassurance that within these thick limestone walls, the work of healing and preservation is continuous, watchful and entirely unshakable. As the hours of the night lengthen, the steady clinking of the stone tools remains a solitary comforting beacon of human dedication, shepherding the inhabitants of the sanctuary through the dark, cold hours toward the distant promise of a peaceful dawn. Beneath the heavy stone foundations of the abbey, down where the massive limestone pillars anchor themselves into the deep mountain bedrock, existed the subterranean vault of the Praefurnium, the great central hearth. This cavernous chamber was the true thermal engine of Empress Adelaide's winter sanctuary, a hidden world of elemental power managed with absolute precision by a dedicated lineage of monastic firekeepers. While the upper halls of the infirmary enjoyed a seamless, quiet warmth, this underground space was defined by the majestic, controlled life of fire itself. The architecture of the hearth was a monument to early medieval engineering, constructed from thousands of oversized volcanic bricks and dense blocks of dark, heat-resistant basalt stone. The vaulting overhead was low and thick, heavily insulated with layers of packed river clay to prevent the immense heat from escaping upward into the storage cellars, ensuring that the entire energy of the furnace was directed exclusively into the network of subterranean flues. At the center of this chamber stood the mouth of the furnace, a massive archway of hand-forged black iron, reinforced with thick rivets and secured by a heavy sliding latch that clicked with a resonant metallic finality when closed. When the attendants gently opened these doors to inspect the core, the immediate interior revealed a landscape of pure incandescent radiance. This was not a place of wild roaring flames that consumed fuel in a frantic burst of energy. Such rapid combustion was inefficient and dangerous. Instead, the furnace was designed to cultivate a massive, deeply set reservoir of glowing coals, a mountain of shifting crimson, gold, and white-hot embers that radiated a steady, unyielding thermal pressure. The air immediately surrounding the furnace mouth shimmered with a translucent, fluid intensity, distorting the outlines of the rust walls and creating a visual manifestation of the raw, hidden vitality that kept the winter chill at bay. The fuel required to sustain this grand engine was selected with a meticulous, seasonal foresight that looked years into the past. Arranged in neat, towering tiers along the dry walls of the vault were immense logs of seasoned mountain oak, harvested from the old-growth forests during the clear summers of previous winters. These logs were massive, requiring 2 lay brothers to hoist them into the furnace bed using long iron-tipped ashwood poles. The bark of the oak was thick, deeply furrowed and rough to the touch, carrying the silver-grey patinas of lichen and the faint, earthy scent of ancient moss that had dried to a crisp finish. Within these timbers lay tightly packed growth rings, each one representing a year of mountain sunlight and mineral-rich earth now compressed into a dense, heavy grain designed to burn with an exceptional slow-burning longevity. When introduced to the amber belly of the hearth, the oak did not catch fire immediately. Rather, it began a slow, majestic carbonization, its surface fracturing into beautiful, geometric checking patterns that glowed with a deep internal ruby light. The design of the draft system within the hearth was a triumph of passive physics, ensuring a clean, continuous pull of air without the need for mechanical bellows. A series of small adjustable air intakes were cut directly into the base of the iron doors, allowing a precise measured current of oxygen to slip across the floor of the furnace. This cold air was instantly superheated as it swept over the bed of embers, rising naturally toward the back of the combustion chamber where the mouth of the main subterranean flue was positioned. The architecture of this junction was sculpted to resemble a smooth, expanding funnel which drew the hot air and radiant gases effortlessly out of the vault and pushed them deep into the labyrinth beneath the infirmary ward. Because the draft was so perfectly balanced, the smoke produced by the burning oak was minimal, stripped of its heavy soot by the high internal temperatures before it could even reach the secondary masonry channels, leaving only a pure, intensely warm thermal current to journey through the building's foundations. Working in this subterranean sanctuary, the firekeepers moved with a slow, deliberate grace that mirrored the steady cadence of the logs they tended. Their tools, long iron scrapers, heavy bronze shovels and rakes forged in the abbey smithy, clinked softly against the stone floor, a muted metallic rhythm that harmonized with the deep, bass-toned hum of the furnace draft. There was no shouting or frantic movement down in the amber-lit shadows. The keepers understood that the maintenance of the sanctuary's warmth was a sacred trust, a continuous vigil that required a patient, watchful presence throughout the long midwinter night. As they adjusted the iron dampeners and replenished the oak timbers, they knew that their silent labor down in the darkness was directly translated into comfort, security, and life for the vulnerable souls resting peacefully in the light above, proving that the true heart of Adelaide's empire was built upon a foundation of sustained, unseen devotion. With the subterranean flues established and the heavy linen mattresses arranged in perfect alignment along the limestone walls, the operational focus of the winter infirmary shifted toward the brewing station, the culinary and medicinal heart of Empress Adelaide's sanctuary. Here, in a wide, shallow alcove designed specifically to vent rising vapors away from the main resting areas, a series of grand copper cauldrons were positioned over dedicated hearth pits. These vessels were objects of immense industrial beauty, hand-hammered by the abbey's master metalsmiths from thick sheets of raw imperial copper. Their surfaces were covered in a dense, geometric pattern of small dimples left by the blacksmith's ball-peen hammer, catching the amber candlelight and reflecting it as a deep, warm orange radiance that seemed to glow from within the metal itself. Copper was selected not merely for its durability but for its unique physical property of rapid, uniform heat conduction, ensuring that the delicate botanical extracts would be steeped evenly, never scorching or degrading under the influence of an uneven fire. The liquid foundation for these infusions was sourced with a rigorous, uncompromising care that reflected the high administrative standards of the Ottonian court. Lay brothers spent the early morning hours drawing water from the abbey's deepest artesian well, which pierced through the mountain bedrock to tap into an isolated, subterranean aquifer fed by ancient glacial melt. This water was exceptional in its purity, crystal clear, completely free of the mineral bitterness often found in lowland streams, and held at a constant, ice-cold temperature that preserved its vitality. When poured into the massive copper cauldrons, the water sat in absolute, mirror-like stillness, its surface reflecting the dark vaulted architecture of the ceiling above. As the small controlled fires of seasoned birchwood began to warm the underbellies of the vessels, the quiet water underwent a slow, fascinating transition. Tiny, silver beads of dissolved air began to form along the interior walls of the copper, clinging to the hammered indentions like rows of miniature pearls before rising lazily, one by one, to break silently at the surface. It was at this precise thermodynamic juncture, when the water reached a gentle, undulating simmer, well before the chaotic violence of a rolling boil, that the guild of caregivers approached with the prepared botanical elements. The hand-carved maple and linden wood bowls containing the pulverized wild thyme, the faded lavender blossoms, and the resinous needles of the rosemary were held over the rims of the cauldrons with a quiet, unhurried precision. Moving with a fluid grace that minimized any disruption to the air, a caregiver would gently tilt the edge of a bowl, allowing the dried herbs to cascade downward in a silent, multicolored stream. The plant matter fell softly upon the moving water, initially forming a thick, floating carpet of dusty greens, muted purples and golden browns that completely blanketed the liquid surface. For several minutes, this botanical mat remained suspended, resisting the water as the dry, concentrated scents of the summer harvest met the rising heat, creating an immediate, intensely aromatic barrier that hovered just above the cauldron's rim. Gradually, the natural laws of absorption began to rewrite the visual landscape within the copper vessels. The dried cellular structures of the herbs, which had been locked in a state of suspended animation since the sun-drenched days of July, began to drink deeply of the pure mountain water. As the leaves and blossoms absorbed the moisture, they expanded, reclaiming their original structural plumpness before growing heavy and slipping slowly away from the surface, drifting downward into the transparent depths like falling leaves in a slow-motion forest. As they descended, they surrendered their hidden chemical wealth to the liquid. The water began to shift beautifully in color, transitioning from absolute clarity into a rich, translucent shade of pale olive green, which gradually deepened into a warm, golden amber hue as the essential oils and natural tannins dissolved completely into the matrix. The soft, rhythmic bubbling of the simmering infusion, a low, wet clicking sound, became the dominant auditory pulse of the brewing alcove. From this simmering alchemy, the first true plumes of botanical steam began to rise, ascending into the cold air of the ward with a majestic, unhurried velocity. The vapour did not burst forth in erratic clouds, but rather crawled upward in thick, lazy silver spirals that curled elegantly around the stone corbels of the vaulting. This steam was the true airborne medicine of Adelaide's design. It carried the microscopic droplets of the thyme's thymol and the rosemary's resinous terpenes into the open space of the infirmary, transforming the physical quality of the air. The atmosphere became thick, soft, and deeply moisturized, cutting through the dry, abrasive quality of the winter draught. As the fragrant vapor drifted across the long hall, it settled gently over the resting mats, wrapping the occupants in a warm, protective shroud that immediately eased dry, winter-worn throats and induced a state of absolute, unshakable tranquility. The sight of this rising steam, illuminated by the golden shafts of candle flame against the ancient grey stone, stood as a beautiful visual guarantee that within this fortress of compassion, the warmth of summer had been successfully resurrected to preserve the life of the realm. The maintenance of a sanctuary dedicated to healing requires a constant, unyielding supply of the earth's most fundamental element, pure, uncontaminated water. In the harsh Alpine winter along the Bavarian frontier, where the surface rivers were transformed into thick, immovable plates of jagged ice, the acquisition of this vital resource was not a matter of simple gathering, but a testament to sophisticated hydrological engineering. Long before the construction of the winter infirmary, the monastic architects had mapped the hidden subterranean veins of the mountains, identifying deep-seated artesian springs that flowed far below the reach of the winter frostline. These springs, fed by the slow millennial melting of high-altitude glaciers, filtered downward through hundreds of feet of porous limestone and dense granite strata. This natural filtration process stripped the water of all surface impurities, enriching it with trace minerals that imparted a crisp, clean vitality and a remarkable natural preservation, making it the perfect medicinal canvas for Empress Adelaide's visionary refuge. To conduct this pristine liquid from the heart of the mountain to the immediate perimeter of the abbey, the builders had constructed a network of subterranean aqueducts, hidden conduits of stone that ran like silent arteries beneath the snow-covered slopes. These channels were masterfully engineered using thick slabs of local slate and interlocking terracotta pipes, buried deep within the earth to utilize the planet's natural insulation against the sub-zero surface temperatures. The interior of these conduits was a world of absolute protected darkness, where the only sound was the soft echoing trickle of the water moving along a precise calculated decline. The air within the tunnels carried a cool, damp stone aroma, completely isolated from the howling blizzards above. By shielding the water from the open sky, the architects ensured that it remained in a state of fluid, unfrozen motion, arriving at the monastery gates at a constant, stable temperature, entirely pristine and ready to sustain the community through the longest droughts of midwinter. The primary termination point for this alpine current was the great central well of the abbey cloister, an architectural feature of immense depth and structural dignity. The well shaft descended over 100 feet into the solid bedrock, its circular walls lined with hand-carved blocks of dark basalt stone, fitted together without mortar to allow the clean spring water to weep naturally through the joints and fill the deep cistern below. Looking down into the opening from the surface, the interior appeared as a vertical corridor of velvet shadow, at the bottom of which the water sat in a state of crystalline, mirror-like stillness. To raise this liquid, the lay brothers operated a massive windlass constructed from a seasoned trunk of mountain ash, fitted with heavy iron hardware and a thick, multi-stranded hemp rope that had been treated with beeswax to resist the rotting effects of constant moisture. The sound of this mechanism in operation, the slow rhythmic creaking of the timber axle, the measured metallic clink of the iron counterweights, and the distant, soft splash as the heavy copper-bound oak bucket breached the subterranean pool constituted one of the most familiar and reassuring cadences of daily monastic life. When the bucket emerged into the pale, diffused light of the courtyard, the water within possessed an extraordinary, luminescent quality. It was so perfectly clear that it seemed almost invisible against the dark wood of the vessel, its presence marked only by the gentle undulating ringlets that caught the silver reflection of the winter sky. This absolute purity was essential to the methodology of the winter infirmary. In the medical philosophies of 10th century Europe, which Empress Adelaide so diligently patronized, water was not merely a solvent but a vital agent of purification that could wash away the internal heat of fevers and restore the bodily humours to a state of calm equilibrium. Drawn fresh from the deep cistern, the mountain spring water was carried into the warmth of the brewing ward in large earthenware amphorae, its icy temperature creating a delicate, frosted condensation on the exterior clay surfaces. This clean, pristine element stood as the silent foundation for every tonic, broth and botanical infusion prepared by the caregivers, ensuring that the healing arts of the sanctuary were built upon the very purest essence that the Alpine earth could provide. The laboratory alcove of the winter infirmary, positioned adjacent to the great brewing cauldrons, hosted a more refined and silent form of botanical transmutation, the art of early medieval distillation. In this quiet corner, away from the gentle hum of the large copper vessels, the master apothecaries and monastic scholars operated the delicate apparatuses of glass and clay that allowed them to extract the absolute spirit of the Alpine flora. While the infusions in the cauldrons provided large volumes of restorative teas, distillation sought the rare, hyper-concentrated essences, the hidden oils and waters that could survive the winter in small vials and deliver potent healing with a single precious drop. Under the thoughtful encouragement of Empress Adelaide, who valued the preservation of both natural and academic wisdom, this space became a testament to the slow, beautiful physics of evaporation and condensation, where time was measured not by the sun but by the steady hypnotic gathering of moisture within the glass. The primary instrument of this refined craft was the alembic, an elegant piece of glasswork whose origins stretched back through the centuries to the ancient alchemists of Alexandria and the golden courts of the Near East. The apparatus consisted of 3 distinct components, arranged with a geometric precision that reflected the harmony of the medieval natural sciences. At the base sat the cucurbit, a heavy round-bottomed flask of thick greenish forest glass which rested securely within a shallow iron basin filled with fine dry river sand. This sand bath, known in the old scrolls as the Balneum Arena, was essential. It served to diffuse the direct heat of the underlying charcoal brazier, preventing the intense flames from cracking the vulnerable glass, and ensuring that the botanical mash within was warmed with an absolute uniform gentleness. Rising from the neck of the flask was the true marvel of the design, the alembic head, a hollow, dome-shaped cap of blown glass that resembled the elegant hood of a nesting falcon, featuring a long, downward-sloping tube that extended outward to hover over a secondary receiving vessel. Inside the dark belly of the boiling flask, the caregivers had placed a concentrated mixture of fresh mountain spring water and the highly resinous needles of the rosemary, or the fragile blossoms of the lavender. As the slow warmth of the sand bath permeated the green glass, the liquid within began to undergo a quiet, molecular awakening. There was no violent tumbling or frantic boiling. Instead, a faint rhythmic simmer developed at the base of the flask, generating a soft, continuous hiss that was barely audible above the breathing of the hearth fire. The heat coaxed the volatile essential oils out of the plant cells, binding them to the rising water vapor. This heavy, fragrant steam ascended slowly through the narrow neck of the flask, a ghostly, swirling column of silver mist that caught the amber light of the candles and illuminated the interior transparency of the glass with an ethereal, shifting glow. Upon reaching the cooler atmosphere of the dome-shaped alembic head, the rising vapor encountered a sudden transformative barrier. The external air of the laboratory, though warmed by the underfloor flues, remained cool enough to arrest the flight of the steam. As the hot moisture-laden air struck the interior surfaces of the glass hood, it began to yield its thermal energy, reverting from an invisible gas back into a tangible fluid state. This process of condensation was a visual masterpiece of slow-motion physics. Tiny, microscopic beads of moisture began to form across the curvature of the glass dome, clustering together like a delicate layer of dew on a summer leaf. Gradually, as more vapor ascended, these tiny beads grew in size, absorbing one another until they transformed into heavy, perfectly formed droplets of crystal-clear distillate. The movement of these droplets was mesmerized by its own slowness. A single tear of liquid would hover for a long, suspended moment against the glass before its own weight forced it to break away and slide gracefully down the interior incline toward the collecting trough. From the interior rim of the dome, the condensed fluid directed itself into the long downward-pointing beak of the alembic, embarking on a gentle journey away from the heat of the fire. As the liquid moved through this cooling channel, it transformed into a steady, rhythmic drop-by-drop cadence that provided a beautiful acoustic anchor for the quiet room. Plip, plip, plip. The droplets fell from the tip of the glass beak into the narrow mouth of a small, dark blue glass vial waiting below. This collected liquid was the hydrosol, a pure, highly aromatic floral water topped by a paper-thin, iridescent layer of pure essential oil that shimmered with shades of gold and green under the candle flame. The sight of this slow mechanical creation, the silent ascent of the steam and the steady crystalline descent of the medicine, provided a profound sense of peace to the observers, standing as a beautiful metaphor for the way Empress Adelaide's governance distilled the vast resources of her empire into precise, enduring acts of protection and comfort for her people. In the quiet southern quadrant of the abbey workshops, removed from the rhythmic clinking of the stonemasons and the gentle bubbling of the brewing alcoves, lay the Candelaria, the dedicated chamber of the candle makers. This room, wrapped in thick limestone walls, maintained a unique atmospheric quality defined by a heavy, intoxicatingly sweet aroma of pure honeycombs and refined wax that had settled into the very grain of the oak workbenches over centuries of seasonal production. For the winter infirmary, the quality of light was considered just as vital as the quality of heat or medicine. Harsh, smoky tallow candles made from animal fat were entirely excluded from the sanctuary ward, as their soot would irritate the chests of the weary and obscure the clean air of the hall. Instead, Empress Adelaide had directed that the imperial storehouses surrender their finest yields of pure yellow beeswax, harvested during the late summer months from the monastery's extensive apiaries that dotted the clover-rich meadows of the Bavarian lowlands. The raw wax arrived in the workshop in the form of large, uniform cakes, each stamped with the seal of the abbey's cellarer. These blocks were magnificent in their material substance, smooth, solid, and possessing a rich golden amber hue that seemed to have captured the absolute essence of the summer sun. When a candle maker used a broad iron knife to shave fragments from the block, the blade moved with a soft, yielding resistance, producing clean, curling ribbons of wax that fell onto the wooden tables with a quiet, rustling sigh. To this sweet floral base, the craftsman introduced a specialized winter additive, pure essential oil of the mountain spruce, distilled using the very techniques observed in the adjacent laboratory alcove. This resinous oil, clear as mountain ice and sharp with the fragrance of the high-altitude evergreen forests, was poured drop by drop into the melting vats, its intense, woodsy notes cutting through the heavy sweetness of the honeyed wax and creating a balanced aromatic compound designed to clarify the senses and refresh the interior atmosphere of the infirmary ward. The heart of the Candelaria was a massive, wide-mouthed iron cauldron that hung from a stout crane over a low-burning hearth of seasoned ash wood. Inside this vessel, the wax fragments were subjected to a slow, indirect heat that transformed the solid blocks into a fluid, shimmering mirror of molten gold. The surface of the liquid was perfectly serene, free of bubbles or turbulence, reflecting the dark stone arches of the ceiling with an absolute luminous clarity. While the wax melted, the apprentices prepared the wicks, a task requiring a steady, patient hand. They utilized slender threads of unbleached flax linen and raw hemp, twisted together in a tight 3-strand braid that ensured a uniform, slow-burning flame that would never sputter or smoke. These wicks were cut to precise lengths and tied at regular intervals to long, horizontal wooden rods, allowing a dozen candles to be crafted simultaneously in a single coordinated movement. The actual creation of the candles was an exercise in pure rhythmic repetition, a hypnotic ritual of descent and ascent that filled the room with a profound sense of artistic dedication. Holding the wooden rod by its ends, the candle maker would step forward to the steaming cauldron. With a slow, unhurried motion, he would lower the braided wicks into the golden pool of molten wax, holding them beneath the surface for a brief, calculated moment to allow the fibers to drink deeply of the hot fluid. The sound of this immersion was a soft, wet hiss, a gentle whisper as the air escaped from the linen threads. The craftsman would then lift the rod vertically, raising the wicks out of the cauldron with a steady, unswerving hand that prevented the liquid from running unevenly down the lengths. As the wicks emerged into the cooler air of the workshop, they were coated in a paper-thin, transparent sheath of golden wax that instantly began to solidify, shifting from a bright, reflective liquid into a smooth, matte finish of pale cream. The rod was then placed upon a long wooden rack to cool, while the candle maker selected a neighbouring rod to repeat the sequence. A single perfectly formed candle required dozens of these successive dips, with each immersion adding only a fraction of an inch to the diameter of the cylinder. The cadence of the workspace was measured by the rhythmic movement between the melting pot and the cooling racks, a slow, continuous loop that produced a faint, distinct acoustic signature. The soft swish of the wicks entering the liquid, the steady, rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the excess gold falling back into the cauldron, and the quiet footsteps of the artisans moving across the stone floor. Over the course of several hours, the slender threads transformed into substantial, heavy columns of pale yellow wax, their surfaces displaying a beautiful, organic variation of subtle rings and ripples that bore witness to the patient layering of human labour. Once the candles had achieved their proper thickness, substantial enough to burn continuously for an entire night without requiring replacement, they were carefully trimmed from the wooden rods using sharp bronze shears, the clean metallic snip marking the completion of the craft. These finished pieces were packed into cedarwood crates, lined with soft wool to protect their smooth surfaces from bruising or cracking during transport. Brought into the winter infirmary, these spruce-infused beeswax candles were positioned on iron sconces and stone corbels throughout the vaulted hall. When illuminated, their flames burned with a calm, steady radiance, casting a warm, amber glow that softened the rugged contours of the limestone walls. The light they provided was entirely stable, free of the flickering anxiety of lesser candles, while the heat of the flames slowly vaporized the embedded spruce oils, filling the sanctuary with a gentle, continuous perfume of honey and pine that promised absolute safety and rest to all who looked upon it. The visual landscape within the fully operational winter infirmary transforms as the final remnants of the pale alpine twilight fade completely from the high horizon, giving way to the absolute, velvety darkness of the midwinter night. Within this expansive, stone-vaulted hall, the atmosphere is defined by a carefully orchestrated choreography of light and shadow, designed under the mindful direction of Empress Adelaide to offer an immediate sense of psychological refuge. The primary illuminant throughout the sanctuary is the collection of spruce-infused beeswax candles, positioned with deliberate geometric regularity upon hand-forged iron sconces and projecting stone corbels that punctuate the long perimeter of the space. This light is completely distinct from the harsh, flickering brilliance of modern illumination or the smoky, acrid glare of common peasant tallow lamps. It possesses a dense, honeyed, and thoroughly amber quality that glows with a gentle, living warmth, casting a serene luminescence that feels deeply grounded and protective. As these golden flames burn with a steady, unhurried cadence, their light interacts masterfully with the physical textures of the architecture. The walls of the ward, constructed from the fine-grained imperial limestone gathered from the mountain quarries, serve as a grand passive canvas for the illumination. The stonemasons had finished the interior faces of these blocks to a smooth, matte texture, allowing the masonry to catch the candle beams without producing harsh, distracting glares. Instead, the pale grey stone seems to drink in the amber light, absorbing its golden qualities and scattering them evenly back into the open space of the hall, so that the entire room appears to radiate a soft, intrinsic glow from within its very foundations. The deeply beveled window embrasures, which had been engineered to maximize the faint daytime sun, now perform an inverse miracle, catching the internal candlelight and reflecting it in soft, overlapping patterns that expand the perceived boundaries of the room, turning what could have been a grim stone fortress into a space of remarkable luminosity and openness. The geometry of the vaulted ceiling introduces a secondary layer of visual artistry to the sanctuary's landscape. High above the rows of resting mats, the Roman-style barrel vaults and intersecting stone ribs receive the rising illumination, their curved contours casting long, soft, and charcoal-toned shadows that trace the architectural framework of the abbey. These shadows are completely devoid of any menacing or unpredictable character, because the candle flames are stable and shielded from sudden drafts by the thick, locked wooden shutters. The shadows move only with a slow, almost imperceptible pulsation, a gentle, rhythmic breathing of light that coordinates beautifully with the absolute silence of the night. This slow movement creates a visual depth within the high registers of the hall, drawing the eyes of the resting patients upward toward the elegant lines of the masonry, where the mind can track the predictable, soothing interplay of dark and gold until a state of absolute cognitive calm is achieved. This luminous environment is further enriched by the physical behavior of the air itself, warmed continuously by the subterranean thermal flues. Directly above the heavy slate floor tiles, the intense rising heat creates a faint, translucent shimmering in the atmosphere, a natural mirage of warmth that causes the beams of candlelight to waver ever so slightly as they cut through the space. This subtle thermal distortion gives the light a fluid, almost aquatic quality, as if the entire hall were cradled within a warm, protective current of golden water. Floating lazily through these illuminated pathways are the microscopic particles of botanical dust from the pulverized thyme and lavender, along with the rising silver spirals of steam from the copper cauldrons. As these elements pass through the columns of candle flame, they catch the light like tiny, brilliant points of gold dust, creating a dreamlike, incandescent display that fills the space with a sense of quiet magic and profound watchful care. The contrast between this internal sanctuary of light and the external reality of the Bavarian winter serves to deepen the profound sense of security felt by all who reside within. Beyond the thick limestone walls and the reinforced iron bars of the doors lies a world of absolute freezing vacancy, a vast, dark wilderness where the sub-zero winds howl across the mountaintops in unchecked chaos. Yet within the perimeter of Adelaide's creation, that entire elemental storm is rendered completely irrelevant, reduced to a silent, invisible adversary that cannot penetrate the golden micro-universe of the ward. The amber glow of the candlelight acts as a visual guarantee of survival, a warm, unyielding barrier that declares that here, human compassion and architectural wisdom have successfully carved out a domain of permanent peace. In this quiet harbour, surrounded by the soft reflections of the stone and the steady, reassuring light of the beeswax cylinders, the weariness of winter is utterly dissolved, allowing the inhabitants to surrender themselves fully to a deep, undisturbed and restorative sleep. As the deep winter night settles completely over the Bavarian frontier, the massive iron-bound doors of the monastery porch serve as the gateway between two entirely different worlds. Outside, across the vast, rolling valleys and jagged peaks, a silent procession of local tenants, forest workers, and weary travellers moves slowly along the obscured paths. These seekers of sanctuary advance with a quiet, determined endurance, their figures appearing as dark, shifting shapes against the immense white landscape. They carry no anger or haste. Their movements are dictated by the simple, profound necessity of finding shelter from an alpine frost that has grown too severe for the humble timber walls of their village cottages. Their breath forms thick silver clouds in the freezing air, and the edges of their woolen capes and felt hoods are stiff with a crust of crystalline hoarfrost that sparkles faintly under the light of the distant winter stars. Each step they take toward the abbey is measured and heavy, their iron-shod boots crunching rhythmically into the packed snow, a solitary sound that emphasizes the absolute stillness of the wilderness surrounding them. Upon reaching the outer courtyard, the travellers are met not by locked gates or indifferent stone, but by the soft, inviting glow of a large bronze lantern suspended above the entrance porch. The heavy oak door, reinforced with thick bands of black imperial iron, swings open slowly and smoothly, moving on hinges that have been carefully greased with tallow to eliminate any harsh, jarring screeches. As the threshold is crossed, the seekers are instantly greeted by the extraordinary microclimate of the completed winter infirmary. It is a physical transition of remarkable intensity. The piercing, sub-zero draft of the Alpine night is suddenly and utterly replaced by a thick enveloping wave of dry, radiant heat that rolls out from the interior of the hall. This warmth, cultivated so precisely by the subterranean flues, acts as an immediate invisible embrace, wrapping itself around the frozen limbs of the travellers and signalling to their senses that the arduous journey through the wilderness has reached its peaceful conclusion. The sensory experience of entering this sanctuary is characterized by a slow, beautiful unraveling of the winter's grip. Standing on the wide flagstones of the entry transition zone, the seekers remain motionless for a few moments, allowing their bodies to adjust to the profound change in environment. The intense warmth of the air immediately begins to melt the frost that has accumulated on their clothing and faces. Tiny frozen crystals on their eyebrows and wool hoods dissolve into clear, pristine droplets of water, sliding gracefully down the textured fabric and falling silently onto the stone floor below. The heavy, stiff garments of boiled wool and sheepskin, which had served as their defensive armor against the blizzards, are gently unclasped and removed with the assistance of the attending lay brothers. The removal of these winter-worn layers reveals a profound physical relief, a shedding of the literal and metaphorical weight of seasonal survival, leaving the travellers unburdened and receptive to the comforting atmosphere of the inner ward. Moving deeper into the long vaulted hall, the feet of the arrivals encounter the true miracle of Empress Adelaide's architectural design, the remarkable radiance of the heated limestone floor tiles. Stepping onto these stones even through the thick leather soles of their boots, the seekers can feel a steady, uniform warmth rising directly from the earth. This heat is completely different from the erratic, searing intensity of an open campfire. It is a deep, foundational thermal pressure that permeates the bones, relaxing muscles that have been tightly knotted against the cold for days. The air around them is rich and fragrant, carrying the mellow notes of the simmering lavender, wild thyme, and spruce-infused beeswax candles that burn quietly along the walls. If you find true comfort in these slow, restorative journeys through the forgotten havens of history, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave a gentle like, and share this sanctuary of words with others who might seek a peaceful harbour for their evening rest. The space remains an enduring testament to the idea that true strength is found in the meticulous care and preservation of the human spirit. Guided by the quiet, melodious whispers of the Guild of Caregivers, the travellers are directed to the neat rows of beds that line the limestone walls. Each person is assigned to a thick linen mattress, stuffed to capacity with the golden, sun-baked summer straw and layered with soft, carded wool fleeces that retain the natural warmth of the abbey's flocks. As they lay their bodies down upon these inviting structures, the physical alignment of comfort is complete. The rising heat from the floor beneath combines with the insulating softness of the bedding to create an absolute cocoon of physical security. The eyes of the seekers wander upward toward the magnificent amber-lit arches of the vaulted ceiling, where the slow, predictable dance of the candle shadows provides a final visual lullaby. Within this fortress of compassion, the howling alpine storms outside are completely forgotten, reduced to a distant, harmless memory as the weary souls surrender themselves entirely to a deep, untroubled and beautifully restorative midwinter sleep. Once the seekers were safely settled upon the thick straw mattresses, the guild of caregivers began the delicate, localized work of soothing the physical toll inflicted by the alpine winter. Exposure to the biting sub-zero winds and the abrasive swirl of ice crystals had left many with skin that was severely chapped, raw and cracked, resembling the rough, weathered bark of the mountain trees they had journeyed past. In the gentle amber illumination of the ward, this treatment was approached not as a hurried chore, but as a quiet, methodical ritual of restoration. The caregivers moved from bed to bed with an unhurried grace, carrying small, shallow cups of polished horn or dark earthenware that contained the specialized golden ointments compounded earlier in the abbey workshops. The primary balm utilized for the face and hands was a rich, smooth blend of pure yellow beeswax and melted pine resin, tempered with a small measure of rendered elderberry oil to ensure pliability. As a caregiver dipped her fingers into the cup, the ambient warmth of the room and her own skin caused the solid salve to soften into a soothing, velvet-like glaze. The application of this ointment to the cracked cheeks and wind-burned foreheads of the travellers was performed with incredibly light, circular strokes. The immediate physical sensation for the weary was one of profound relief. The protective layer of wax instantly sealed the microscopic fissures in the skin, locking out the dry interior air and creating a cooling, defensive barrier that arrested the throbbing sting of the frost. A secondary, deeper treatment was reserved for the hands of the labourers and foresters, whose skin was calloused and split from handling frozen timber and iron tools in the high passes. For these rugged limbs, the caregivers deployed a thicker salve infused with the concentrate extract of silver willow bark and dried chamomile blossoms. This ointment carried a distinct, reassuring aroma. The deep, resinous perfume of the pine woods mingled with a subtle honeyed sweetness and the clean, bitter edge of the medicinal bark. The caregivers massaged the balm deeply into the palms and around the knuckles, their warm hands working rhythmically to break the tension of tightly knotted muscles. The quiet, repetitive sound of skin moving against skin, a soft, dry whisper, blended seamlessly into the gentle acoustic tapestry of the vaulted hall. As the botanical mixtures met the natural heat of the patients' bodies, the aromatic release intensified, filling the immediate space around each bed with a localized cloud of healing vapor. The travelers lay in absolute, serene stillness, their eyes closed as they yielded entirely to the gentle touch of the guild. This systematic care transformed the physical experience of recovery. It was a tangible manifestation of Empress Adelaide's protective vision, proving that within this stone sanctuary, every individual, no matter how humble, was worthy of the Empire's finest craftsmanship and most dedicated compassion. With their skin protected and their bodies thoroughly warmed by the subterranean flues, the seekers slipped deeper into a state of absolute, untroubled repose, their slow, even breathing marking the perfect harmony achieved within the safe walls of the infirmary. As the external blizzard reached its midnight crescendo, rattling the reinforced iron hinges of the high clerestory windows, a different sort of warmth began to circulate from the hearth alcoves. The restoration of the seekers required more than external heat and topical balms. It demanded an internal fortification to replace the vital energies consumed by their struggle through the alpine drifts. Under the direction of the abbey's head cook and the senior herbalists, great black iron cauldrons, distinct from the copper vessels used for pure distillations, had been simmering since mid-afternoon. Within these heavy basins, the kitchen line prepared a deeply restorative pottage, crafted from ancient, robust grains and nutrient-rich forest elements specifically selected to revive cold-worn digestive systems. The foundation of this sustaining broth relied on dense quantities of emmer and winter spelt, grains prized by the Ottonian farmers for their structural resilience and nutty, comforting flavor profiles. These grains had been cracked coarsely between the monastery's massive granite millstones, allowing them to release their thick starches slowly into the simmering mountain spring water. To this rich, starchy base, the caregivers added dried roots of wild celery, wild leeks gathered from the lower valley terraces before the first hard freeze, and handfuls of dried chanterelle mushrooms from the autumn stores. The resulting mixture was not a thin, volatile soup, but a thick, opaque, and deeply substantive pottage that bubbled with a slow, heavy rhythm, venting a dense cloud of savoury steam that carried the unmistakable aroma of a bountiful harvest home. The distribution of the food was managed with the same unhurried, rhythmic precision that defined the entire sanctuary. Lay brothers moved down the central aisle of the ward carrying large, double-handled wicker baskets lined with clean linen to retain the heat of the freshly ladled dishes. The pottage was served in deep, thick-walled bowls turned from solid blocks of beech and maple wood, materials that naturally insulated the contents while remaining comfortably cool to the touch for weakened hands. Beside each bowl rested a broad, shallow spoon carved from smooth horn, which made no harsh, metallic clattering against the tableware. The acoustic landscape of the hall softened further as the seekers began to eat. The sharp howling of the storm outside was entirely eclipsed by the gentle, repetitive sound of wooden spoons scraping softly against wood, followed by the quiet, satisfied sighs of individuals experiencing the first true return of internal vitality. To complement the dense grains, the caregivers infused the broth with a subtle medicinal layer of juniper berries and dried rose hips. In the humoral tradition of the 10th century, these forest fruits were understood to contain a concentrated sharpness that could pierce through the stagnant, heavy cold settling in the chest and stomach. As the hot liquid was consumed, the immediate psychological effect on the travellers was profound. The combination of the rising thermal heat from the limestone floor tiles beneath their mats and the radiant energy of the warm-grained pottage within created a dual pincers of comfort, thoroughly banishing the residual chill from their bodies. The colour returned to pale cheeks, tight shoulders relaxed into the soft linen mattresses, and a sense of absolute well-nourished safety settled over the entire assembly, proving once again that Adelaide's refuge was a complete mechanism of human preservation. As the heavy iron hands of the Abbey's water clock slipped past the midnight marker, a profound collective stillness descended upon the winter ward. The frantic energies of the elemental storm outside, though still throwing weight against the thick limestone buttresses, were entirely muted within this sanctuary of stone and fire. The internal atmosphere had achieved a perfect, balanced equilibrium, nourished by the rich emmer pottage and comforted by the soothing botanical balms. The seekers had succumbed one by one to the restorative pull of deep, uninterrupted sleep. The long hall was no longer a theatre of movement, but a harbour of absolute repose, where the only remaining activity was the slow, rhythmic breathing of dozens of resting souls. The visual landscape of the ward softened to accommodate this period of rest. The caregivers moved through the shadows, systematically extinguishing the higher candle sconces to reduce the ambient light to a low, protective amber glow. Only a few select beeswax cylinders remained illuminated near the structural pillars, casting long, unmoving reflections across the smooth limestone floor tiles. In this dimmed environment, the rising heat from the subterranean hypocaust channels created a visible shimmer in the lower air, a gentle thermal wave that cradled the sleeping figures on their thick straw mattresses. The fragrance of the room had settled into a rich, mature tapestry, the clean, sweet scent of honeyed wax deeply intertwined with the lingering, earthy notes of wild thyme and resinous spruce. While the upper ward slept, the vigil of the firekeepers in the subterranean Praefurnium intensified. Down in the basalt-lined depths, the passage of midnight marked the most critical phase of the winter night, when the external temperatures dropped to their lowest, deadliest registers. The keepers moved with silent, non-verbal coordination, their faces illuminated by the intense ruby glare of the open furnace core. They understood that any lapse in vigilance, any drop in the thermal output of the hearth, would allow the creeping mountain frost to reclaim the foundations of the building above. With slow, calculated movements, they wielded long iron oars to adjust the massive bed of glowing oak embers, ensuring a perfectly uniform distribution of heat across the mouth of the main flue. To sustain the fire through the remaining hours of darkness, the keepers introduced the largest, most dense logs of seasoned winter ash from the deepest reserves. The sound of this labour was remarkably controlled. The heavy timbers were slid into the incandescent belly of the furnace with a muffled, sliding thud, followed by the metallic click of the iron fire doors swinging shut. The draft system responded instantly, pulling the newly generated thermal currents smoothly into the labyrinth beneath the floorboards. Above, the sleeping travellers remained entirely unaware of this subterranean industry, feeling only the constant, unyielding warmth that rose evenly through the stones to guard their rest against the sub-zero night. The long, unyielding vigil of the winter night finally began to soften as the first subtle currents of the morning hours approached. High above the rows of silently breathing seekers, the heavy gloom of the vaulted ceiling slowly surrendered to a fragile, pale silver twilight. This initial light did not burst dramatically into the room, rather it bled progressively through the massive, high-arched eastern clerestory windows, which had been engineered by the Ottonian architects specifically to capture the earliest orientation of the winter sun. The heavy glass panes, though shielded externally by thick wooden shutters, were rimmed with intricate crystalline frost patterns that caught the incoming light, fracturing it into thousands of tiny, prismatic shards that danced quietly across the opposing limestone walls. As the illumination grew from a faint slate grey to a warm, translucent amber, it revealed the absolute success of Empress Adelaide's sanctuary. The environment within the ward remained perfectly preserved, entirely untouched by the sub-zero chaos that still lingered outside the masonry perimeter. The rising heat from the subterranean hypercaust flues continued to cast its gentle, invisible wave across the floor, maintaining a steady, protective microclimate that had shepherded every soul safely through the deadliest hours of the dark. The aroma of the hall had transformed once more. The heavy midnight notes of resinous spruce and wax now mingled with the fresh, clean scent of the morning air, signaling a safe transition from the anxieties of survival to the peaceful reality of a new day. One by one, the occupants of the mats began to stir, their movements unhurried and thoroughly rested. There were no sudden awaking shocks or cold shivers. Instead, the travellers stretched their limbs against the soft linen mattresses, their faces illuminated by the clean, golden beams of the mounting sun. The caregivers, who had maintained their watchful presence through the changing watches, stepped forward with warm basins of spring water and fresh infusions of wild thyme, their low, melodious voices welcoming the seekers into the light. The arrival of this Alpine dawn stood as a silent, magnificent triumph, a tangible proof that through historical foresight, architectural wisdom, and unyielding human compassion, the crushing weight of the winter wilderness could be utterly dissolved, leaving behind a legacy of permanent shelter, restoration, and hope for the realm. The channel History Under Moonlight is a storytelling platform created for entertainment, inspiration, education, and the promotion of relaxation and peaceful sleep. All stories presented on this channel are global historical tales, gently curated and narrated based on themes such as the rise and fall of nations, human cultures, and extraordinary journeys through time.